I never planned to hike alone. My name is Daniel Harper. I was 27 years old in the summer of 2019 when I set off on a week-long solo hiking trip on the Appalachian Trail, specifically a stretch in the Smoky Mountains of Tennessee. I had done some group hikes before, but this was my first real solo adventure, and I had prepared carefully, or so I thought. I packed light but sensible. A sturdy backpack, a tent, a sleeping bag, a compact stove, canned food, a water filter, maps, compass, first aid kit, flashlight with spare batteries, a pocket knife, and a whistle. I also had my phone, although I knew reception would be spotty in the mountains. I had always loved hiking because it felt like a break from the noisy, crowded world. The trail was supposed to be quiet, peaceful, and full of natural beauty. The Smokies, with their rolling green hills and thick woods, were the perfect place for it. I was eager to test my limits and spend a few days away from everything. The first 2 days went well. I followed the trail markers, passed other hikers who were friendly but brief, and camped at designated spots. The weather was warm but comfortable, with occasional light rain that only added to the fresh scent of pine and earth. On the third day, things started to feel different. I had planned a longer stretch, aiming to cover about 15 miles. I woke up early, packed quickly, and set off while the mist still hovered low over the ground. The woods were quiet, apart from the usual birds and insects. The trail wound through dense forest, sometimes along ridges with breathtaking views of the mountains. I kept a steady pace, stopping occasionally to drink water and eat a little. By mid-afternoon, the sun had climbed higher and burned off the morning fog. The air grew warmer, and sweat started to trickle down my back. I didn't feel tired yet, so I pressed on. But then I noticed something strange. The trail markers were fewer and further between. I thought maybe I had missed a sign. I stopped, pulled out my map, and compared it with the surroundings. The trees looked familiar, but the trail didn't match perfectly with the map. I walked back a few steps to check again, but everything looked the same. I decided to trust the map and kept moving forward, thinking I might have simply misread the markers. But after another mile or so, I realized I had reached a fork in the path with no signs at all. This was when a flicker of unease crept into my mind. I paused and tried to listen. There was no wind, no birds, just silence. That stillness was unnatural and unsettling. I took a deep breath and tried to calm myself. I knew that losing the trail wasn't the end of the world. I could retrace my steps if needed, but something else made me stop dead in my tracks. Off to my right, down a small slope, I saw a narrow dirt path that wasn't on my map. It looked fresh, like someone had been there recently. The grass was flattened as if footsteps had passed. I stared at it for a long time, feeling a strange pull. My gut told me not to follow it, but my curiosity got the better of me. I told myself maybe it led to a campsite or some shelter. So I decided to walk down it, keeping my backpack tight and my hand close to my knife. The path was steep and slippery, covered in loose leaves and small rocks. I moved slowly, making sure to keep my balance. After about 10 minutes, it led to a small clearing where I saw an old, abandoned cabin. It looked like it hadn't been used for years. Broken windows, moss growing on the roof, and vines wrapping around the wooden walls. The sight gave me mixed feelings. I felt relief because I had found a landmark, but also a weird unease because the cabin was so out of place, isolated deep in the forest. I walked around it carefully, looking for any signs of recent activity. I found none. I decided to leave the cabin behind and return to the main trail. But when I turned around, I couldn't find the path I had just taken down the slope. The thick undergrowth seemed to have swallowed it up. I searched for a few minutes, but everything looked like dense forest. No clear trail. Panic started to build. I realized I might be truly lost. I thought about using my phone's GPS, but there was no signal. My compass pointed north, but I didn't know if that would help without a clear trail. The sun was starting to dip low, and shadows were lengthening between the trees. I had to make a choice. Try to stay put or move on and hope to find a trail or someone before dark. I chose to move. I headed north, following the compass. The forest was thick, with branches scraping my arms and bushes catching on my clothes. The ground was uneven, covered in roots and stones. I stumbled a few times, scraping my knees and hands. As I walked, the forest grew darker. The canopy above blocked out most of the remaining light. I realized how quickly the sun could disappear in the mountains. I regretted not bringing a stronger flashlight. My breathing became heavy. My heart was pounding, not just from the physical exertion but from fear. I tried to keep calm and focus on each step. Hours passed. The light faded almost completely. I turned on my flashlight, but the batteries weren't as strong as I hoped. The beam barely lit up a few feet ahead. I called out softly, hoping someone would hear, but only silence answered. Cold started to creep into my bones as the temperature dropped quickly. I regretted not packing warmer clothes. My food was almost gone, and I had only a small amount of water left. Eventually, I found a slight depression in the ground that could shelter me from the wind. I set up my tent quickly, though my hands trembled. I curled up inside with my sleeping bag, trying to keep warm. The night was long and terrifying. Every noise sounded like a threat. The crack of a twig, the rustle of leaves, the distant howl of an animal. I told myself it was probably just a deer or a raccoon, but the fear gnawed at me. I tried to stay awake, but exhaustion took over in fits and starts. When dawn finally came, I was still alive but weak and cold. I packed up as best I could and continued north, hoping to find a road, a ranger station, or any sign of civilization. After hours of slow, careful walking, I spotted a faint trail marker. It was old and worn but still visible. Relief washed over me. I followed the trail markers carefully, paying close attention. Gradually, the trees thinned and the terrain leveled out. By late afternoon, I heard the distant sound of a highway and eventually reached a Forest Service road. I flagged down a passing car, and they called for help. The rescue team found me dehydrated and exhausted but otherwise okay. They said I had been off trail for more than 24 hours. I learned a lot from that experience. The forest is beautiful but unforgiving. Respecting the trail, preparing for the worst, and knowing your limits can mean the difference between survival and disaster. I still remember that trip in the summer of 2012, when I was 27 years old. I had been living in Colorado for a couple of years by then, working a regular office job, and the weekends were my only escape. Hiking was my way to disconnect, to breathe fresh air, to feel something real beyond the endless screens and concrete. That July, I decided to tackle a section of the Indian Peaks Wilderness, a rugged, remote area north of Boulder. I'd been there before on shorter day hikes, but this time I wanted to push further. A solo overnight hike to a small lake I had read about in an old trail guide. The plan was simple. Leave early morning, hike about 12 miles to Lake Isabel, camp overnight, then head back the next day. I packed light but enough. A small tent, a sleeping bag rated for the cool mountain nights, a stove, some food, and plenty of water. The weather was forecast to be stable, clear skies and mid-70s during the day. I told a friend about my plans before leaving, something I always did. It was a familiar routine by then. The first several hours of the hike were peaceful. The trailhead started at around 9,400 feet elevation, winding through dense pine forests and wildflower meadows. The air was cool, crisp, with the faint scent of pine needles and damp earth after an earlier rain. Birds called in the branches, and small chipmunks darted between the roots. The trail steadily climbed, but the incline was gentle, giving me time to settle into a rhythm. My pack felt heavy but manageable. Around midday, I reached a clearing where I could see the jagged peaks in the distance, glinting under the bright sun. The higher I climbed, the thinner the air felt. My breath came a bit faster, but I kept a steady pace, stopping occasionally to drink water or adjust my pack. After about 6 hours, I reached a ridge and spotted Lake Isabel far below, a glistening blue mirror nestled in the alpine basin. The descent to the lake was steep and rocky. Loose gravel and uneven stones made footing tricky. I took my time, careful not to slip. Around 4 p.m., I arrived at the lake's edge. It was more beautiful than I had imagined. Clear water, surrounded by towering cliffs and a few scattered spruce trees. I set up my tent on a flat patch just above the shore and unpacked my small stove to boil water for dinner. The solitude was complete, just the sounds of water lapping softly, wind through the trees, and the distant call of a hawk. As the sun lowered behind the peaks, the temperature dropped quickly. I wore all my layers and crawled into my sleeping bag early, feeling tired but satisfied. The night was quiet, save for the occasional rustle of small animals nearby. I slept fitfully but deeply. I woke before dawn to the chill and an uneasy feeling. The sky was still dark, the stars bright and countless. I stepped outside the tent, breathing in the cold morning air. A thin layer of frost covered the grass and rocks. I planned to leave early to beat the heat and make it back before evening. I packed everything carefully, double-checking my gear, and started hiking back the way I came. The trail was steeper going up now, and the loose stones made it slow going. I felt a little tired from the climb but kept pushing. Around mid-morning, about 3 hours into my return hike, I noticed something strange. A narrow side trail veered off the main path. It wasn't marked on my map, and I didn't remember seeing it on the way in. Curiosity got the better of me, so I paused to inspect. The path looked less traveled, overgrown with bushes and fallen branches. No obvious reason to take it, so I decided to ignore it and stay on the main trail. A short time later, as I rounded a bend near a cluster of large boulders, I realized my pack felt lighter than before. At first, I thought I might have shifted some gear inside. But then I noticed the zipper of my backpack was partially open, and the small water bottle I had strapped to the side was missing. My heart skipped. I always made sure my gear was secure, especially when alone. I scanned the surrounding area carefully. No sign of anyone else on the trail. The forest was silent except for the faint breeze and distant bird calls. It was strange but not necessarily alarming. Maybe the bottle had slipped out somehow when I bent over or rested. I slowed my pace, more cautious now, paying close attention to every noise and movement. I reached a small creek crossing and refilled my water from the clear mountain stream. The cold water revived me somewhat. A few miles later, just as I reached a wider section of the trail lined with tall aspens, I heard a snapping branch behind me. My breath caught. I stopped immediately, turning slowly but seeing nothing. No movement in the trees, no animal sounds. Nothing except the wind through the leaves. I told myself it was probably a deer or a squirrel, but the feeling of unease lingered. I picked up my pace, eyes scanning the forest edges. The trail wound uphill now, steeper and narrower. The sun was getting stronger, and I was sweating despite the elevation. After an hour of hiking, the trail opened up to a small clearing with a large fallen tree across one side. I decided to take a break here, sitting on a rock to catch my breath. I drank some water and ate a granola bar. My legs felt tired but not injured. That's when I noticed something else. A piece of red fabric caught on a low branch near the clearing. I approached and saw it was part of a shirt or jacket, torn and dirty. My heart raced. This wasn't mine. I had never seen anything like it on this trail before. There was no sign of recent hikers or campers nearby, just wilderness. I pocketed the fabric carefully, thinking it might be important, but the growing feeling of dread was hard to shake. I had been hiking alone in this remote area for almost 2 days now, and something didn't feel right. I decided not to linger. I stood up and pushed onward, the trail climbing steadily. The forest thickened again, darker under the canopy. My legs burned as I ascended. Every now and then, I heard noises that sounded like footsteps or rustling behind me, but whenever I looked back, no one was there. At one point, I heard a sharp, quick shout. Not human voice exactly, but a harsh sound like a bark or a scream. It echoed through the trees. My heart jumped into my throat. I froze, listening hard, but there was no follow-up, no footsteps, just silence. Panic began to rise. I was alone, miles from the trailhead, with no signal on my phone. I tried calling out, but my voice sounded weak and swallowed by the forest. I pressed on, faster now, my legs aching but adrenaline carrying me forward. The trail started to descend, winding through dense forest and rocky outcroppings. My pack felt heavier with every step. I checked the time, early afternoon now. I hoped to reach the parking lot before dark. About an hour later, as I neared a familiar switchback, I heard the sound again, closer this time. The snapping of twigs, hurried steps. I spun around but saw nothing. The forest was thick and shadowed, but no person, no animal. My breath was ragged. I broke into a run, stumbling on rocks and roots, desperate to get away. I didn't know what was following me, but the fear was overwhelming. Suddenly, the trail opened up to a clearing with a small abandoned ranger cabin. It was weathered and falling apart, but it offered some shelter. I ran to it and slipped inside, bolting the old wooden door. Inside, the cabin was dark and dusty, the floor covered in pine needles and debris. A broken window let in a sliver of sunlight. I leaned against the wall, trying to steady my breathing. Outside, I could still hear faint noises. Footsteps, branches breaking, but no voices. Minutes passed, then an hour. The sounds faded. I stayed inside until dusk, too afraid to leave. When the last light disappeared, I made a plan. I couldn't stay there forever, and I needed to get out. I waited for nightfall to reduce the chance of whoever or whatever was outside seeing me. I gathered a sturdy branch to use as a makeshift weapon. Under the cover of darkness, I slipped out quietly, following the faint glow of my headlamp toward the trailhead. My legs trembled, but I moved as fast and carefully as I could. It took 2 more hours, but I finally saw the edge of the forest and the parking lot lights. My heart soared with relief. A group of campers was still there, and I rushed over, breathless and shaking. I told them I had been lost and scared, and they helped me call for assistance. Rangers arrived and escorted me back to safety. Later, I learned that a group of hunters had been tracking illegally in that area, and a search was underway. The torn fabric I found matched clothing from one of the missing hikers. The experience changed me. I still love hiking, but now I carry more gear, tell more people where I'm going, and trust my instincts when something feels wrong. Looking back, the fear I felt was real, but I was lucky to get out alive. Nature can be beautiful but unforgiving, and sometimes the scariest things come from the people you never see until it's too late. It was the summer of 2012 when I decided to take a solo hiking trip deep into the Bitterroot Mountains in western Montana. I was 28 years old then, fit, and eager for some solitude away from my hectic city life in Missoula. I'd done plenty of hikes before, but this time I wanted to go farther and longer. Several days alone in the wilderness, just me, my gear, and the trail. The plan was simple. I'd start at the trailhead near Lolo Hot Springs, follow the trail eastward along the west fork of the Bitterroot River, camp at a few established spots, then loop back. I'd packed my gear carefully. A lightweight tent, a sleeping bag rated for cold nights, a stove, enough food for 4 days, a map and compass, and a small first aid kit. I also brought a GPS device, although I kept that in my pack most of the time, preferring to navigate by map and natural landmarks. I left early one August morning, the air still crisp and cool. The forest was thick with fir and pine, the scent of damp earth and resin filling the air. Birdsong was everywhere, a constant backdrop to the crunch of my boots on the dirt trail. The river ran beside me, glinting silver in the patches of sunlight that broke through the canopy. The first 2 days went exactly as planned. I moved at a steady pace, stopping to rest by the river and drink from it after filtering the water with my purifier. The trail was well maintained, but rugged roots and rocks made footing tricky, but nothing I couldn't handle. At night, I camped in small clearings where I pitched my tent, cooked dehydrated meals, and lay awake listening to the sounds of the forest. Owls hooting, the distant rustle of animals moving through the underbrush. On the 3rd day, I pushed farther than before. My legs were tired, but I felt strong. I was heading toward a remote ridge I'd read about, hoping to get a good view of the valley below. The trail became less obvious as I climbed higher. The trees thinned out, replaced by scraggly bushes and exposed rock. The sun was warm and bright, the sky an endless blue. That afternoon, while crossing a narrow ledge, I spotted fresh bear tracks in the soft dirt. My heart jumped, but I knew I had to keep calm. I made noise, clapping my hands and stamping my boots to alert any animals of my presence. I also made sure to keep my bear spray handy, clipped to my belt. I reached the ridge by late afternoon and paused to catch my breath. The view was incredible, mountains rolling away in every direction, the valley stretching out like a vast green carpet. I took pictures and scribbled notes in my journal about the colors of the landscape and the way the light shifted on the peaks. I started to head back down as the sun dropped lower in the sky. The trail became harder to see, covered in fallen needles and leaves. I kept an eye on my map and compass, but soon realized I was slightly off course. The forest looked unfamiliar. The trail markers I expected to see were missing. I tried to retrace my steps, but the terrain was rougher here. Steep inclines, loose rocks, and thick undergrowth. I decided to find a flat spot and set up camp for the night, rather than risk injury or getting more lost in the dark. I found a small clearing near a creek, pitched my tent quickly, and cooked a simple meal by the light of my headlamp. That night, I barely slept. The forest felt alive in a way I hadn't noticed before. Every sound seemed louder, closer. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying strange smells and the faint echo of something moving far off. I kept my knife close at hand and my bear spray within reach. Morning brought a dull gray sky and light rain. I packed up, hoping to get back on track and find the main trail. I studied my map again, realizing I had veered almost 2 miles east of my intended route. I estimated it would take a full day to get back to the trailhead if I moved quickly. As I walked, the forest grew thicker and darker. The rain made the ground slippery, and my boots squelched in the mud. The creek I followed twisted and turned, sometimes disappearing under fallen logs or dense brush. I knew I had to stay calm and conserve energy. Around midday, I came to a narrow ravine. The creek disappeared down a steep drop, and the only way forward was a thin path along the edge of the cliff. I carefully balanced, my heart pounding as I looked down the sheer rock face. Suddenly, a loud crack echoed through the trees. A branch, heavy with rain, snapped above me, showering wet leaves. My foot slipped on the wet dirt, and I barely caught myself before falling. My palms scraped against the rocks, sharp and cold. I took a deep breath and moved slowly, step by careful step, until I was past the dangerous spot. By late afternoon, my energy was almost gone. My stomach growled despite the snacks I'd eaten. I was soaked through, chilled by the rain and sweat. I knew I had to find a safe place to rest again. I stumbled onto a small clearing with dead trees scattered around. It looked like a logging area or a fire break. I set up my tent in the mud, frustrated but knowing I had no choice. That night was the worst. The rain fell hard, drumming on the tent like a drumbeat. The wind moaned through the broken trees, rocking my small shelter. Somewhere nearby, a large animal called out, a deep, guttural growl that sent shivers down my spine. I stayed inside, clutching my flashlight and hoping whatever it was would stay away. Morning brought an uneasy calm. The rain had stopped, but the sky was heavy with gray clouds. I looked at my map and compass again, trying to plan my final push back to the trailhead. As I moved through the forest, the terrain changed. The trees thinned, replaced by dense brush and fallen logs. I was tired and hungry, but I pushed on. I had to make it out. Late in the afternoon, I caught sight of a small dirt road through the trees. Relief washed over me. I was close to civilization. I followed the road until I saw a parked truck and a couple of hikers returning from their trip. I showed them my GPS and explained my situation without words, just gestures. They offered me water and a ride back to the trailhead. Back at my car, I sat quietly, exhausted but safe. The experience had tested me in ways I hadn't imagined. I'd been alone, scared, and unsure if I'd find my way out. But I did. The forest was beautiful, wild, and sometimes dangerous. It taught me respect for nature's power and the importance of preparation. I never took my safety for granted again. I had planned this hiking trip for months. The summer of 2018 was already heating up, and I needed a break from the city, the noise, the endless screens, and people. I was 28, living in Portland, Oregon, and had grown up in the Pacific Northwest, so the mountains and forests had always felt like home. Still, I was not a seasoned backcountry expert. I wasn't reckless, but I also wasn't the most cautious hiker. This trip was supposed to be a chance to clear my head, get some solitude, and challenge myself. I chose a trail in the Mount Hood National Forest. It was a moderate trail I hadn't done before, known as the Eagle Creek Loop. The summer sun filtered through the thick canopy of Douglas firs and cedars, casting dappled shadows on the rocky dirt path. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, with the faintest hint of wildflowers. I carried a day pack, light but with enough food, water, a first aid kit, and a basic map. I didn't bring a GPS or phone signal booster. I wanted to disconnect. The first few hours went smoothly. Birds chirped somewhere high in the trees. I saw a squirrel dart across the path, pausing briefly to look at me before disappearing into the underbrush. The trail wound upward, following the sound of a rushing stream to my right. I stopped to drink and fill my water bottle, enjoying the cool splash on my hands. The sun climbed higher, and sweat dripped down my back. The trail became steeper, the rocks sharper underfoot. I took care to watch my step, feeling the burn in my legs. By midday, I reached a small clearing with a breathtaking view of Mount Hood's snow-capped peak. The wind was cooler here, and I sat on a fallen log to rest and eat my sandwich. The silence was deep and complete, broken only by the occasional buzz of insects and the rustle of leaves. I felt peaceful, almost at one with the forest. This was exactly what I needed. After my break, I pressed on, following the narrow trail that looped back toward the trailhead. The path became more rugged and less traveled. Roots and rocks jutted out, forcing me to pay close attention. I noticed the sunlight dimming slightly as the forest thickened again. Somewhere nearby, the sound of a woodpecker echoed, steady and rhythmic. As afternoon turned into early evening, I realized I was moving slower than I had planned. I didn't want to rush. Part of the trip was to savor the experience, but I also knew I needed to finish before dark. I glanced at my watch. 5:15 p.m. The trailhead was still several miles away. I quickened my pace, trying to maintain a steady rhythm. The forest grew quieter. The canopy above was dense, and patches of sky were now tinged with orange and pink. I reminded myself to stay alert, to keep an eye on the trail markers carved into trees. The terrain grew more uneven. I stumbled over a root but caught myself before falling. Then something shifted in the air. I felt it before I saw it. A subtle change in the sounds around me, the rustling of leaves, the snap of a twig somewhere to my left. My heart rate quickened. I paused and scanned the trees, my eyes adjusting to the dim light. At first, I thought it might be an animal, maybe a deer or a large bird. But then I saw the movement. Not graceful or hurried like a wild animal, but deliberate, slow, almost stalking. Two dark shapes, low to the ground, creeping between the trees about 50 yards away. Fear prickled down my spine. I had read stories about bear encounters, mountain lions, and worst of all, humans who weren't safe. I wasn't carrying bear spray, and I hadn't expected to run into anyone on this trail at this hour. I tried to steady my breathing, reminding myself to stay calm. I knew the basic advice. Don't run, don't turn your back, make yourself look big. But this wasn't a bear or a mountain lion. It looked like people. My mind raced through the worst-case scenarios. I took a small step backward, careful not to make noise. The two figures stopped moving, freezing like statues behind the thick trees. My pulse hammered in my ears. I looked for an escape route. The trail behind me was clear, but it would mean backtracking in fading light. I decided to keep moving forward slowly, hoping to reach a clearing where I might have better visibility. My eyes darted constantly, searching for the shapes that seemed to shadow my movements. The forest grew darker and the air colder. Suddenly, a voice, low and harsh, too close, broke the silence. I couldn't make out the words, but it was angry, threatening. I froze, every muscle tight. My hands gripped my backpack straps. The two figures stepped out onto the trail. One was taller, wearing a dark jacket and a baseball cap pulled low. The other was shorter, stocky, his face partially obscured by a scruffy beard. Neither smiled. Both had something in their hands, sticks, rocks, or maybe knives. It was hard to tell in the low light. I swallowed hard and decided I had to act. I reached into my pack and pulled out my small hiking knife. Not much, but better than nothing. I told myself to keep calm, to try to appear confident. The taller man stepped forward and blocked the trail, raising his hand as if to stop me. My heart threatened to burst. I looked past him for any way to slip away. The trees were close, the underbrush thick. Suddenly, the shorter man lunged toward me, shouting something incomprehensible. I sidestepped quickly, slashing the air with my knife. It wasn't a clean cut, but it was enough to startle him. I ran, feet pounding the rocky trail, branches whipping my face and arms. The sounds of pursuit echoed behind me, shouting, crashing through brush. My lungs burned, legs trembling, but I pushed on. I didn't dare look back. The sun had almost set, and the forest was nearly pitch black. I could barely see the trail. I stumbled over a large root and fell hard onto my knees. Pain flared, but I scrambled up immediately, pushing forward. Finally, I heard voices again, but different this time. Raised shouts, the sound of boots pounding from a different direction. I veered off the trail, crawling under low branches, desperate to hide. I pressed myself against the trunk of a huge cedar, panting and trembling. The dark figures ran past the clearing a few yards away, yelling but not seeing me. After what felt like an eternity, the noise faded. I waited, heart hammering, until I was sure they were gone. Then I rose shakily and made my way down the hill, away from the trail. The problem was I was lost. The forest was dense, and without the trail markers, it was almost impossible to know which way to go. My phone had no signal and I had no compass. Panic threatened to overwhelm me, but I forced myself to focus. I tried to recall the map I'd studied before the trip. The trail looped around a ridge and descended to a creek near the parking lot. If I followed the sound of running water, I might find the creek. I moved cautiously, picking my way through thick underbrush. The sky was now fully dark, and the moon barely pierced the canopy. The sounds of nocturnal animals surrounded me. Owls, frogs, insects, and I felt more alone than ever. After an hour of slow, careful walking, I heard it, the unmistakable sound of flowing water. Relief flooded me. I headed toward it, hoping it would lead me back to the parking lot. The creek was cold and fast-moving, cutting through the forest like a silver ribbon. I followed it downstream, slipping on wet rocks and pulling myself over fallen logs. My knees and hands were scratched and bruised, but I ignored the pain. Eventually, the trees thinned, and I saw faint lights ahead, the headlights of cars in the parking area. I stumbled out of the forest and onto the gravel lot, collapsing on the ground, gasping for breath. I waited there, shivering and soaked in sweat, until a late hiker came out from their car and saw me. They called 911. Within an hour, park rangers and police were at the scene. I gave a statement describing the two men who had chased me on the trail. Authorities searched the area but found no sign of them. In the days that followed, I realized how lucky I was. I had survived by sheer instinct, by remembering small details, and by staying calm under pressure. That night in the forest, alone and hunted, taught me how vulnerable we can be in nature. Not from ghosts or monsters, but from real people and real danger. I never returned to that trail, but I kept hiking with more caution and respect. And whenever I tell the story, I remind myself that fear isn't just about what we imagine. Sometimes it's about what's really out there. It was the summer of 1998, a dry and warm July in the northern reaches of Idaho. I was 29 years old, and I had spent most of my life around the forests, but I wasn't what anyone would call an expert hiker. I knew the basics, carried the usual gear, and liked to test myself with day hikes or quick overnighters. I wasn't looking for adventure or glory. I just wanted to be out in the wild, away from everything. No noise, no people, no schedules. The forest had always been a place of quiet for me. That year, I decided to hike a trail I had read about in an old ranger pamphlet, a trail called the Bear Creek Loop. It wasn't a very popular trail, which I liked. It promised about 15 miles of rocky paths, creeks, and dense woods, winding through parts of the Selkirk Mountains. I packed my gear carefully the night before. I had a backpack with water, some energy bars, a lightweight tent, a first aid kit, a map and compass, a flashlight, and a few extra layers of clothing. I didn't bring much food because I planned to be back by the end of the day or early the next morning at the latest. My plan was to camp near a creek midway through and then return the next day. I left my car early, just as the sun was climbing above the tree line. The air was cool and sharp. The gravel road that led to the trailhead was dusty and empty. No other cars were there. It was a good sign. I liked to feel alone in the forest. I tightened my boots, slung my pack over my shoulder, and took a deep breath of pine-scented air before stepping onto the path. The trail was narrow and sometimes overgrown. The first few miles were peaceful. I walked slowly, enjoying the sounds of the forest, the rustling of leaves, the chirping of birds, the distant rush of the creek I was supposed to follow. The trees were mostly fir and cedar, tall and straight, their branches creating patches of shade on the trail. Sunlight filtered through in golden spots. As I went deeper, the trail began to change. The ground was rougher, scattered with loose stones and fallen branches. I could tell I was moving into less traveled parts. There were no footprints, no litter, nothing that suggested other people had passed recently. The silence grew heavier, except for the occasional call of a jay or the snap of a twig beneath my boots. By early afternoon, I reached the first creek crossing. The water was cold and clear. I knelt and drank some, letting the cold water cool me down. I paused for a moment, looking around. The sky was clear, a deep blue with no clouds. I checked my map and compass, making sure I was still on course. The trail climbed steeply after the creek. It was a tough stretch, the kind that makes you sweat and breathe hard. I moved slowly, pausing often to catch my breath. My legs burned, but I felt strong. The forest thinned as I climbed higher, and the trees grew shorter and scrubbier. Eventually, I reached a ridge where I stopped to rest. From the ridge, I could see a wide valley below, thick with trees and crossed by a winding river. The view was breathtaking. I sat on a flat rock, taking out a water bottle and a granola bar. I ate slowly, savoring the quiet and the clean air. I felt at peace, exactly where I wanted to be. After resting, I pushed on, following the trail down toward Bear Creek. The path twisted through rocky outcrops and patches of wildflowers. I spotted a few deer in the distance, moving cautiously through the bushes. I didn't try to get closer. Felt good just to see them from afar. I arrived at the creek as the sun began to lower. The water gurgled over smooth stones, and there was a small clearing nearby with soft moss and fallen logs. It was the perfect place to set up camp for the night. I unpacked my tent, rolled out my sleeping bag, and gathered some dry twigs for a fire. The process of setting up camp was familiar and comforting. I worked efficiently, knowing I had to finish before dark. When the tent was up, I built a small fire ring from stones and carefully lit the fire. The flames crackled and warmed the clearing. I cooked a simple meal of canned beans warmed over the fire and ate slowly, feeling the tiredness from the day's hike settle into my bones. As the sky darkened, stars began to appear, tiny pinpricks of light in the velvet black. I sat quietly beside the fire, feeling small in the vastness of the forest. There was no wind, no rustling branches, just the steady sound of the creek and the occasional pop from the fire. I went to sleep early, wrapped in my sleeping bag inside the tent, with the fire still glowing softly outside. I felt safe, but I wasn't safe. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up suddenly. I wasn't sure what had stirred me. Maybe it was the cold or some strange feeling. The air inside the tent felt thick and still. I listened carefully, but I couldn't hear anything beyond the gentle flow of the creek. I unzipped the tent flap a little and peeked out. The fire had mostly burned down to embers. The forest was dark and silent. The moon was a thin crescent, barely lighting the shadows. I lay back down but couldn't fall asleep. I kept hearing a faint noise, something like a soft crunching or rustling in the bushes. At first, I thought it was just an animal, a raccoon or maybe a deer, but the sound was irregular, not like a steady walk, more like something moving slowly and carefully, maybe stopping often. I tried to stay calm, telling myself that this was normal. Animals move at night. That's what the forest is. But the noise kept coming closer. I sat up, listening. It sounded like something heavy, stepping on dry leaves and twigs. Closer now, near the edge of the clearing. I grabbed my flashlight and clicked it on, sweeping the beam around. The light caught nothing, just trees, rocks, and shadows. I breathed hard, heart pounding. I didn't have a weapon, only my hiking poles and a small pocket knife. Not much to defend myself if something wanted to attack. I tried to think logically. What could it be? A bear? They do come down to streams at night. But I had been careful all day to store food in a sealed container, away from my tent. I had read about bears being cautious around humans, often just passing through without bothering campers who were alert. Still, the thought of a bear prowling nearby made me freeze. The sound stopped. I waited, holding my breath. Then, I heard it again, but this time it was a different noise. A soft thud against a tree trunk, like something bumping or brushing. I swung the flashlight beam toward the noise. Nothing. My mind raced. Maybe a large animal was investigating my camp, curious about the fire or smell of food. Maybe it was just a large deer. I tried to calm down, reminding myself that panicking wouldn't help. I zipped up the tent and curled up, shining the light just outside the mesh flap. I stayed awake for hours, listening. When the first rays of dawn crept through the trees, I felt a small relief. The forest looked less threatening in daylight. I packed up quickly, eager to get moving. I followed the trail downstream, back toward the trailhead. The sounds of the forest were waking up. Birds chirping, insects buzzing, the creek babbling happily. But as I walked, I kept looking around. Something didn't feel right. I noticed fresh footprints in the soft mud near the creek. They were large, much larger than mine, and irregular. I couldn't say for sure what animal made them, but they were too big for a deer or elk. They reminded me of the tracks I'd once seen in a nature documentary about bears, huge with claw marks. Cold knot formed in my stomach. I tried to stay focused on the trail. I checked the map often, making sure I was heading the right way. But the trail wasn't as clear as I had expected. Branches and fallen trees blocked parts of the path. It seemed like no one had been here for a long time. Hours passed, and the sun climbed higher. I stopped at a small clearing to rest and drink water. While sitting, I noticed something strange. A set of broken branches off the trail, leading deeper into the forest. They looked fresh, snapped recently, as if someone or something had pushed through. I debated whether to follow them or keep on the trail. I didn't want to get lost, but curiosity gnawed at me. After a few minutes, I decided to stay on the path. That decision probably saved me. As afternoon turned into evening, the forest became denser again. The trail narrowed, and I began to feel the weight of exhaustion. My legs were sore, my feet ached, and the sun was low behind the trees. I started thinking about finding a place to camp again. Then I heard it, a low growl, deep and guttural, coming from the brush nearby. I froze. My heart pounded in my chest. The growl came again, closer this time. I looked around, searching for the source. In the fading light, I caught a glimpse of a large dark shape moving behind some trees, just out of clear sight. A bear, a big one. I grabbed my poles, trying to make myself look bigger and louder. I shouted in my head to scare it off, but the bear didn't run. It stepped out into the clearing, its eyes fixed on me. I felt the cold grip of fear. I remembered everything I had read about bear encounters. It was the summer of 2014 when I decided to take a solo hiking trip in the Cascades, Washington. I was 27 then, working a desk job in Seattle that drained me slowly every day. The city noise, the endless emails, and the fluorescent office lights all pushed me towards something quieter, wilder. I had been hiking since I was a teenager, but had never gone alone on a long trek. This time, I wanted to push myself, to be away from people and distractions, to just be by myself in nature. I packed my bag carefully the night before, making sure I had all the essentials: water filter, a good map of the area, extra food, warm clothes, a small first aid kit, and my trusted compass. I didn't want to rely too much on my phone because I knew the reception would be spotty at best in those mountains. I had chosen a section of trail that ran along a ridge overlooking the valley below, a spot not too far from the trailhead, but wild enough to feel truly remote. The plan was to hike in, camp one night, and hike out the next day. I started early in the morning, just as the sun was rising. The air was cool, crisp, and smelled of pine needles and earth. The trail was soft beneath my boots, winding up through dense fir trees and patches of wildflowers. As I climbed, the sounds of the forest surrounded me. Bird calls, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush, the occasional crack of a twig. The first few hours went smoothly. I kept a steady pace, stopping only for short breaks to sip water and take in the view whenever the trees thinned and I could see down into the valley. The sky was a brilliant blue, dotted with small white clouds that moved slowly. A few hawks circled high above, riding the thermals. I felt a light thrill of freedom. No schedules, no noise, just the path ahead and the forest around me. As midday approached, I reached a small clearing near the top of the ridge. The wind was stronger up here, and the view was stunning. Below, a river snaked through the valley, shining in the sunlight like a silver ribbon. The distant peaks on the horizon were still capped with snow, despite the warm summer day. I sat on a large rock, ate some trail mix, and rested. I drank water carefully, knowing I had to conserve it, but also not wanting to dehydrate. After the break, I packed up and continued along the ridge. The trail became narrower and rockier, with roots and stones forcing me to watch my step. I felt a quiet satisfaction in the challenge. But as the afternoon wore on, I began to notice the weather changing. The sky, once clear, started to cloud over. Gray clouds rolled in from the west, and the wind picked up, rustling the trees in a rougher way. I checked my watch and estimated I had about 2 hours of daylight left before sunset. The map showed a small campsite just a little further along the ridge, near a cluster of large boulders. That's where I wanted to set up camp. The wind turned colder as I moved forward. I pulled my jacket tighter around me and quickened my pace, hoping to reach shelter before the weather got worse. Then, without warning, a light rain began to fall. At first just a few drops, then heavier. The path grew slippery with wet leaves and mud, making each step more cautious. As I reached the boulder cluster, I was soaked through, my boots squelching with water. The campsite was a small flat spot sheltered somewhat by the rocks and trees, but the wind gusted through anyway. I quickly found a dry spot, unpacked my tent, and set it up, struggling a bit as my fingers got cold and wet. Inside the tent, I changed into dry clothes and tried to dry out some of my gear with my small camping towel. Outside, the rain turned into a steady downpour. The wind howled through the trees, bending branches and sending leaves swirling. It was dark now, only late afternoon, but the thick clouds and rain blocked out much of the remaining light. I lit my small camping stove and warmed up some canned soup, grateful for the heat. That night, I lay inside my sleeping bag, listening to the storm outside. The rain beat on the tent's nylon walls, the wind tugged at the stakes, and somewhere nearby, the sound of rushing water grew louder. I realized that the rain was feeding a small stream that ran close to my camp. I was glad I hadn't set up directly next to it. But then something made me uneasy. A sharp crack echoed through the forest, followed by a series of heavy thuds. It sounded like branches breaking. My heart jumped. I told myself it was probably just a large animal, maybe a deer or a bear, moving through the trees. The thought didn't calm me. I tried to steady my breathing and remember my training. Stay calm, stay quiet, wait it out. The noise grew closer, moving around the campsite, circling. I held my flashlight, shining it cautiously out the tent flap, but the rain blurred the beam. The shadows beyond the trees shifted. My mind raced, thinking about what I should do if the animal came near. I had a small bear spray in my bag, but it was packed away. I debated grabbing it but didn't want to make sudden moves and draw attention. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Then the noises stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was even more unsettling than the noise. I stayed awake the rest of the night, listening to the rain and the occasional rustle of the forest, waiting for dawn. When the first pale light of morning finally came, the storm had passed. The clouds broke, and the sun peeked through, warming the wet earth. I packed up slowly, checking everything twice. The ground was muddy, and my boots left deep prints as I started back down the trail. The morning hike was quieter, but still tense. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been watching me. I scanned the forest edges for any sign, and then I saw it. Large footprints in the soft mud near the stream. They were deep and wide, unlike anything I'd seen before. I took photos with my phone and made notes, recognizing them as bear prints. Not small black bear prints, but those of a larger grizzly. That explained the noises from the night before. The rest of the hike down felt much faster, driven by adrenaline. The sun was shining now, and the forest seemed less threatening in the daylight, but I kept my senses sharp. When I finally reached the trailhead, I was relieved beyond words. I returned home safely that day, but the experience stuck with me. I learned that nature is unpredictable and that even experienced hikers can find themselves vulnerable when they are truly alone. I realized how important it is to respect wildlife, prepare for the worst, and never underestimate the quiet dangers hidden in the forest. The trip gave me a new respect for the wilderness, and I never went hiking alone again. I stick to groups now, carry bear spray easily accessible, and always tell someone my plan. That summer, I learned that survival is about awareness, preparation, and respect, not just courage. It was the summer of 2014 when I decided to take a solo hiking trip deep into the Cascades, a range of rugged mountains in Washington state. I was 28 years old, fit and used to weekend hikes, but nothing like this. The idea was to spend a week away from the noise of the city, the rush of work, and all the distractions that piled up in my everyday life. I had always loved the wilderness, the way the trees stood tall and silent, the rivers running clear and cold, and the endless blue skies stretched out above. This trip was supposed to be a reset for me. I planned the hike carefully. I chose a route that would take me through some of the more remote parts of the Mount Baker Snoqualmie National Forest. The trail started near a small town called Concrete, about 70 miles north of Seattle. From there, the path would wind through dense forests, cross several rivers, and climb high ridges with stunning views. I packed light but thoroughly. A sturdy tent, a sleeping bag, a stove, enough food for 7 days, water purification tablets, and a detailed map with a compass. I also brought a GPS device, although I knew it could fail in thick forests. My phone had little signal there, but I kept it powered off to save battery. The first day went smoothly. The air was fresh, cool, and smelled of pine. I walked about 12 miles, stopping only to eat and rest briefly. The trail was narrow in places, sometimes covered in fallen leaves or small rocks, but well marked with orange blazes on the trees. I loved the feeling of being alone but not lonely. The birds chirped above, squirrels darted through the underbrush, and every now and then, I caught sight of deer grazing quietly in the distance. By the second day, I had reached a small clearing near a river. The sound of rushing water was calming, and I stopped there for the night. I pitched my tent carefully, making sure it was far enough from the water in case of unexpected rain. The temperature dropped quickly after sunset, and the forest grew quiet except for the river's roar and the occasional hoot of an owl. I ate some dehydrated pasta and drank water I purified from the river. I felt good, strong, and ready for the days ahead. On the third day, the trail became steeper. I climbed a ridge that gave me a breathtaking view of the valley below, with green trees stretching as far as I could see. I paused often to catch my breath and drink water, the sun shining warm on my back. Near the top, I noticed some fresh bear tracks in the mud. They were large, maybe from a black bear. I didn't panic. Bears were common in these parts, but I made sure to be loud and careful as I continued. banging a stick against a tree every few minutes to alert any nearby animals. That afternoon, while crossing a small stream, I slipped on a wet rock. My ankle twisted painfully, but it didn't break. I sat for a while, massaging it and deciding whether to turn back or keep going. The pain was dull but noticeable, and the swelling began almost immediately. After some thought, I chose to continue slowly. The camp for that night was planned just a few miles ahead, so I figured I could manage. By the fourth day, the ankle was worse. The swelling had increased, and every step sent a sharp stab of pain through it. I walked carefully, using my trekking poles more than ever to support myself. My pace slowed dramatically. I had hoped the trail would flatten out, but it remained rugged and uneven. I began to worry about the possibility of needing rescue, but I told myself to stay calm. I had a first aid kit and knew how to tape and stabilize a sprained ankle. I did that the night before, wrapping my ankle tightly with the elastic bandage. The pain lessened somewhat with rest and elevation. The forest around me was thick now, almost oppressive. The trees stood close together, their branches tangled and blocking out much of the sunlight. The air smelled damp and earthy, and the ground was muddy from recent rains. I was alone, with no other hikers in sight, and my phone still showed no signal. The GPS was working intermittently, but the battery was draining fast. I rationed my power, using it only when I absolutely needed to check my location. On the fifth day, I faced the toughest challenge yet. The trail split into several smaller paths, none of which were well marked. I consulted my map carefully. According to it, the correct route should take me around a large ridge and then downhill to a campsite near a small lake. But the trails I saw did not match the map exactly. The landmarks I expected, the rock formations, a large fallen tree, were nowhere to be found. I checked the GPS, hoping for some clarity. It showed my position, but the trail line on the device seemed off. My heart sank. I realized I might be off the trail or worse, lost. The forest here was dense and dark, and the canopy blocked out much of the light. I stood still for a moment, taking deep breaths to calm myself. Panic would only make things worse. I decided to mark my location on the GPS and backtrack a little to find the last clear point on the trail. This meant retracing several miles, which my ankle hated, but I knew it was the safest choice. As I turned back, the forest seemed to close in even more, the sounds of the river now distant. I moved slowly, eyes scanning for any sign of the trail markers I had seen days before. Hours passed. The sun began to dip lower in the sky, turning the forest shadows long and eerie. The temperature dropped too, and I felt a chill despite my jacket. I stopped to rest several times, chewing on energy bars and drinking water from my bottle. The ankle throbbed painfully, and I considered stopping to camp right where I was, but the ground was uneven, and I had no clear spot for my tent. Finally, near dusk, I spotted a familiar orange blaze on a tree. Relief flooded through me. I was back on the trail. I set up camp quickly, knowing night in the wilderness could be dangerous if unprepared. I boiled water for tea, ate some dried fruit, and checked my supplies. The food was running low, and the pain in my ankle was worse than ever. That night, I slept fitfully. Every movement sent sharp pains through my leg, and the noises of the forest, crackling branches, distant animal calls, kept me alert. I thought about the next day. The nearest ranger station was at least 15 miles away, over rough terrain. My hope was to limp back slowly, resting often, and make it out safely. On the sixth day, my situation worsened. My ankle had swollen significantly and turned purple in places. Walking was agonizing, but I forced myself to keep going. The trail wound through dense undergrowth, the air thick and humid. I kept my eyes fixed on the ground, trying to avoid any tripping hazards. Each step was a test of will. At one point, I slipped again on a patch of wet leaves and fell hard onto the ground. The shock of hitting the earth and the sudden jolt to my ankle nearly made me cry out, but I held my breath. I lay there for a moment, staring up at the trees swaying gently in the breeze. The silence was heavy. Slowly, I got back up, leaning heavily on my poles. I told myself this was just part of the struggle and that I could do it. I kept walking step by painful step, putting one foot in front of the other. Hours later, I finally reached a small clearing that matched one of the spots on my map. It was near a wide river with a wooden footbridge crossing it. I paused there, exhausted. The sun was high and hot, and I rested on a large rock near the water's edge. I splashed cold river water over my face and hands, feeling the sharp contrast to my aching body. I looked around for signs of other hikers but saw no one. That's when I noticed something unusual. Footprints in the soft mud near the bridge. They were human, barefoot, and fresh. They led into the forest on the other side of the river but disappeared after a short distance. My heart started to race. For a moment, I imagined all kinds of worst-case scenarios. Someone following me, someone living illegally in the woods, or even a threat. But I had no way to know. I decided to keep moving. Crossing the bridge was tricky because the wood was slippery and some planks looked rotten. I stepped carefully, eyes focused on the path ahead. On the other side, the forest opened into a more open area, with wildflowers and low shrubs. The terrain was easier here, and my pace improved slightly. The 7th day was the longest and most grueling. I woke early, before dawn, to maximize the daylight. My ankle was still badly swollen, but the pain was duller, perhaps because I was more exhausted than ever. The trail led uphill, a slow climb toward a ridge that promised a view and, hopefully, a connection to civilization. As I climbed, the wind picked up, blowing through the trees with a low moan. The clouds rolled in, dark and threatening rain. I kept moving, scanning the horizon. Finally, near the top, I saw it. A narrow dirt road cutting through the trees. It was the service road for the forest rangers, and I knew it led back to the main highway. I pushed myself harder, each step fueled by the thought of help and safety. The rain began just as I reached the road, light at first, then heavier. I didn't care. It was the summer of 1997 when I decided to take a solo hiking trip in the Cascade Mountains of Washington. I was 28 years old then, feeling the itch for some serious time alone in nature to escape the noise of my city life in Seattle. I wasn't an expert hiker by any means, but I was comfortable with long walks and had done a few short backpacking trips before. This time, I planned a multi-day trek along a less traveled path called the Goat Ridge Trail, known for its beautiful wildflower meadows and high ridges with views of snow-capped peaks. The day started cool and crisp, the kind of summer morning that feels fresh and full of promise. I packed my light backpack carefully. A tent, sleeping bag, a small stove, water filters, canned food, trail mix, and a map printed from an old hiking guidebook. I had no cell phone, no GPS, just my compass and map. In those days, that was how most people did it. The trailhead was quiet when I arrived just after dawn. A small parking lot surrounded by tall evergreens. A few early risers were getting ready to leave, their footsteps crunching softly on the gravel as I began the hike. The trail was narrow but well marked. It twisted through dense forest, with sunlight breaking through the leaves in golden patches. At first, the woods were alive with the chirping of birds, the rustling of squirrels, and the faint buzz of insects. The smell of pine and damp earth filled the air. The path climbed steadily but not steeply, and after a few hours, I reached a clearing overlooking a deep valley below, where a river glimmered like a silver thread far away. The view was breathtaking, and I took a long break, eating some trail mix and sipping water from my bottle. I was alone but not lonely. The solitude was welcome. I liked the feeling of being disconnected from the world, with only the sound of the wind and the occasional cry of a hawk overhead. As the day wore on, I continued up the trail. The trees grew thinner, replaced by bushes and wildflowers, lupins, paintbrush, and fireweed bright against the green grass. The scent of flowers mingled with the fresh mountain air. I planned to camp at a small site near a tarn, a little mountain lake, about 10 miles up the trail. The hike was tough but manageable. My boots pressed into the soft soil, and the occasional rock forced me to steady my steps. Around mid-afternoon, dark clouds began to gather in the distance. The wind picked up. I felt a flicker of unease but thought nothing of it. Mountain weather changes fast. I always packed a rain jacket and some warm clothes. The trail led me around a bend and suddenly, the ground became wet and muddy. A thin creek crossed the path, swollen from recent rains. The forest here was dense and quiet, the tall pines like silent sentinels. As I crossed the creek carefully, I noticed the sky had turned a strange shade of gray, almost greenish. The air felt heavier, like before a storm. I quickened my pace, wanting to reach the campsite before the weather got worse. The rain started lightly, a steady drizzle at first, then a sharp downpour. I stopped to put on my rain jacket and pulled my hood tight. The trail became slippery and hard to follow in some places. I kept my eyes on the map, trying to match landmarks. I finally spotted the tarn through the trees, a small, glassy pool reflecting the stormy sky. The campsite was a tiny clearing nearby, with a few flattened spots for tents and a fire ring. I set up my tent quickly, fumbling with wet hands as the rain intensified. The wind howled through the branches, bending the trees and rattling the tent poles. Once inside the tent, I felt a mix of relief and anxiety. The storm was loud, relentless. The water dripped down the rainfly, and the cold seeped through the thin fabric. I ate a simple dinner and lay back, listening to the storm rage outside. The loneliness settled deeper, pressing in on me like the darkness. That night, something felt off. Couldn't sleep. The sounds outside were too loud. Crashing branches, the slap of rain on leaves, and something else. A low, heavy thudding noise, rhythmic and slow, like footsteps or something large moving just beyond the tree line. I strained to listen but couldn't be sure. My heart pounded. I wanted to tell myself it was just the storm, the wind, maybe a bear or deer. But the noise didn't stop. It got closer. Then suddenly it stopped. The silence afterward was worse than the noise. My breathing was loud in the tent, and I imagined every shadow moving. I stayed awake until dawn, holding my flashlight close. When morning finally came, the storm had passed. The forest was wet and dripping, the air fresh but heavy with the smell of wet pine. I stepped outside the tent carefully. The ground was torn up around the campsite, the bushes pushed aside. The tarn looked still, peaceful in the early light. I packed up quickly, wanting to get off the mountain. The trail back seemed longer somehow, the forest darker with heavy clouds still hanging low. As I walked, I kept thinking about the sounds I'd heard and the disturbed ground. Something had been there, close, watching. I didn't want to believe it was human, but I had no other explanation. Around midday, I reached a fork in the trail. The map showed my path continuing straight, but I noticed fresh footprints in the mud, large, heavy, unlike any animal I knew. They headed to the right, off the main path. I stopped and stared, my stomach knotting. I debated whether to follow the footprints or keep to the trail. Part of me wanted to see what had made them, the other part screamed to stay safe and get out. I chose the trail. As I walked faster, the forest grew quiet again. No birds, no rustling animals. Just me and the damp earth beneath my feet. Suddenly, I heard a snapping noise behind me. I stopped and turned slowly. There was nothing. The trail was empty. I started walking again, quickening my pace, eyes scanning for movement. The feeling of being watched returned. I heard another snap, then a branch falling off to the side. I broke into a run, heart racing, lungs burning. The trail twisted sharply down the ridge, steeper and more treacherous. My boots slipped on wet rocks. I fell twice, scraping my hands and knees. The forest seemed endless, the trees closing in like walls. My legs screamed to stop, but I kept running, driven by fear I couldn't explain. After what felt like hours, I reached the trailhead parking lot. There was my car, empty and waiting. I got in, locked the doors, and started the engine with shaky hands. I didn't look back as I drove down the mountain road. Weeks later, I learned from a park ranger that hikers had reported strange noises and broken branches along Goat Ridge Trail, and some even found footprints that didn't match any known animal. They warned about increased presence of illegal hunters in the area, some known to carry large firearms and move stealthily. No one had seen them during the day, but the forest after dark was dangerous. I never went back to that trail. The memory of those footsteps in the mud, the broken branches, and the heavy silence in the forest stayed with me for a long time. What I realized most clearly was this: out there in the wilderness, you are never truly alone, and sometimes the scariest things are the ones you can't see but know are close. It was early October 2018. I had just turned 32 a few months before, and I was going through a phase where I thought I needed to be alone more often. I had quit my job in Philadelphia that summer, mostly out of burnout, and had taken some freelance remote gigs that paid just enough to cover rent. I told myself I'd use that time to find peace, or whatever nonsense people call it when they burn out and run away from everything. I wasn't married, didn't have kids, and most of my friends were busy with their own lives. So when I told people I was driving out to West Virginia to hike and maybe camp for a few days, nobody cared much. One or two people said, "Stay safe," in passing. That was about it. The area I picked was called Cranberry Wilderness. I had found it online a few weeks earlier. It looked huge and remote, less popular than places like the Smokies or Shenandoah, but still full of trails, trees, and solitude. I liked that. I didn't want to see other people. I wasn't trying to make small talk with strangers on a trail or wave at families with kids while pretending to enjoy it. I just wanted to be away. I drove down in my old Subaru on a Friday, stopped in a small town called Richwood for gas and a sandwich, and then made my way up to the trailhead. I had printed out some maps since I knew cell service would probably disappear, and I also had a decent GPS watch that could track distance and elevation. The plan was simple: hike the north-south trail deep into the wilderness, maybe do a loop, camp one night, and hike out the next day. I brought 2 days worth of food, water purification tablets, an emergency blanket, and a first aid kit. I had bear spray, a small knife, and a headlamp. I thought I was being smart. I parked around noon, adjusted my pack, locked the car, and headed in. The weather was perfect, low 60s, sunny, and dry. The trail was quiet and peaceful. I didn't see a single person that first day. There were a few downed trees across the path here and there, and I had to climb over or around them, but overall it was easygoing. I hiked for maybe 5 hours, took plenty of breaks, and found a small clearing near a stream to set up my tent. I cooked some instant rice with tuna using my little camp stove, sat on a log, and ate while watching the stream. It was peaceful, the kind of quiet that made your ears ring. I liked it. That night was colder than I expected. My sleeping bag was supposed to be rated for 30 degrees, but it felt a lot closer to freezing. I wore most of my layers and kept my hat on. I didn't sleep well. Woke up several times to the sound of rustling leaves or maybe animals moving around. It wasn't scary, just annoying. Around 3 a.m., I heard something bigger walking nearby, and I grabbed my bear spray, but nothing came close. Eventually, I fell asleep again and woke up at dawn. It was foggy, cold, and damp. I boiled water for instant coffee, packed up, and hit the trail again. I hadn't picked a firm route for the second day. I just knew I wanted to loop around and head back a different way. I checked the map and decided to follow a connector trail called Big Beachy Run, which would take me back toward the southern part of the wilderness and eventually connect with the South Fork Trail, which ran closer to the parking area. I figured I'd hike most of the day and either camp again or try to push all the way back to the car before nightfall. I still felt good, so I figured I had options. That was my mistake. Around midday, I crossed a ridge and started descending into a deeper hollow. The forest got denser. The trail narrowed and got harder to follow. There were orange markers on trees, but sometimes they were missing for long stretches, and fallen logs made it confusing. I had to check my map constantly. I wasn't worried yet, just annoyed. I didn't want to lose daylight. It was cloudy now, and the light was dim under the trees. Around 2 p.m., I noticed the air felt different. There was this faint smell of smoke, like someone had lit a campfire nearby, but I hadn't seen anyone since I got there. I kept walking and figured maybe someone was camping down by the river. Then I heard it, distant popping sounds, sharp cracks, like someone smacking a branch against a tree, but louder and more regular. I stopped walking, listened. Another pop, then another. Gunshots. That's when it clicked. It was hunting season. I remembered reading something about early hunting seasons in October, but I thought they were further south or maybe not allowed in wilderness areas. But now I could hear multiple shots in the distance, maybe a quarter mile away. I felt exposed all of a sudden. I was wearing a dark green jacket, gray pants, and a black beanie. No orange, no vest, no flag, nothing to show I was a person, not an animal. I crouched down behind a log and listened. More shots, then silence. I waited a long time trying to calm myself down. I figured it was best to just move carefully and try to get out of the area. I remembered that a lot of wilderness areas were open to hunting in the fall, and I should have double-checked the regulations before coming out. I felt stupid, but it wasn't the time to dwell on it. I had to move. I kept walking, but slower now, trying to make noise. Snapping branches, scuffing my boots, anything to not sound like a deer. I thought about tying a bandana to a stick and waving it, but it was blue, not orange. Probably wouldn't help much. The trail faded even more as I went deeper. At some point, I realized I hadn't seen a trail marker in over an hour. I checked my GPS, and it showed me somewhere between two ridges, but I couldn't tell which way the actual trail had gone. I tried to backtrack, but the woods had a way of shifting around. What looked like the trail one way looked like a runoff stream the other. Everything was wet and covered in leaves. I started walking in what I thought was the right direction, but then I hit a marshy patch with thick undergrowth and had to detour around. That's when I heard footsteps. Not animals. Not fast, panicked, crashing movement like deer usually make. These were slow. Crunch. Pause. Crunch. Someone walking. I stopped and crouched again. Listened. The sound came from the left, downhill, near the marsh. I couldn't see anything through the trees, but the footsteps were steady. Then they stopped. I waited, not breathing. I held my bear spray in one hand and crouched as low as I could. I didn't want to shout or make noise. What if they weren't hunters? What if they weren't supposed to be there? What if they weren't friendly? I waited maybe 10 minutes. Nothing. No more steps. Just the wind in the trees. I moved again, slowly, trying to climb uphill and get back to higher ground. I figured that would help me find a trail or maybe a viewpoint to reorient myself. But the ground was slick, and the slope was steeper than it looked. My boots kept sliding, and every branch I grabbed felt like it might snap. I finally pulled myself up over a ledge and found what looked like an old overgrown path, maybe used for logging a long time ago. It went east, so I followed it. It was getting darker now. Not sunset dark, but thick cloud dark, like a storm was coming. The wind picked up, and leaves started swirling around. I checked my watch. It was only 3:45 p.m., but the forest looked like dusk. I knew I needed to either find shelter or get out. I was tired, soaked in sweat, and starting to feel cold. I'd burned through half my water, and one of my knees was starting to hurt from all the climbing. That's when I found the shell casings. 3 of them, shiny brass, lying in the dirt near a tree. Not old, not rusted, not buried, clean and fresh. They weren't scattered either. They were placed almost in a line, like someone had stood there and fired in one direction. I felt my stomach drop. I turned around fast, scanned the woods. Nothing. I knelt, picked one up, and put it back down. I didn't like that at all. I kept moving. Then I saw something that made me stop dead in my tracks. Hanging from a low tree branch was a strip of orange cloth. Not flagging tape, not a marker. It was torn fabric. Looked like part of a vest. Ripped and tied into a knot around the branch. Below it, a small cleared space with crushed grass and 2 empty food wrappers. Someone had been there, not long ago. I backed away, heart pounding. I didn't know if it was someone camping, someone hunting, or something else, but I didn't want to find out. I turned and moved fast, too fast, down the other side of the ridge, not even thinking about direction anymore. I just wanted distance. The forest closed in. The trees were closer, the undergrowth thicker. I scraped my arms on thorns and slipped twice on loose rocks. My knee hurt worse now. I thought I'd twisted something. At some point, I stopped hearing the wind. No birds, no rustling, just silence. And then, faintly behind me, footsteps again. Crunch. Pause. Crunch. I didn't turn around. I just moved. I don't know how far I walked, maybe a mile, maybe two. I was limping badly by then. It was almost dark. I couldn't feel my fingers. I finally found a flat spot with some brush cover and decided I had no choice. I camp again, just for the night. Try to stay warm. Hike out at dawn. I was too far gone to keep going safely. I set up my tent in record time. Skipped. I set out early that morning in late September, 1998, alone, to hike a long trail deep in the Bitter Ridge wilderness of northern Montana. The air was sharp and cool, with the faint scent of pine and damp earth that always stirs something inside me. I was 28 years old, physically fit, and had done a few long hikes before, but this was to be my first solo overnight trip into this part of the forest. The trailhead was about 15 miles from the nearest small town, tucked away behind a gravel road that twisted through dense fir and spruce. My backpack felt heavy, packed carefully with my tent, food, water purification tablets, a first aid kit, and some extra layers. I had a map and compass and a small handheld GPS, though back then those devices were bulky and had limited battery life. Still, I trusted my ability to navigate by map and compass, especially in daylight. The trail started off well-marked, a narrow dirt path winding between tall trees and over small rocky creeks. The forest was quiet except for the occasional call of a bird or the rustle of a squirrel scurrying through the leaves. I liked that silence, the kind that made you aware of every breath, every crunch of your boots on the trail. Felt peaceful, almost sacred. After about 2 hours of steady walking, I reached a clearing where the sun broke through the canopy, warming the forest floor. I stopped to drink some water and rest. I checked my map and compass. I was on track to reach the backcountry campsite near Little Bear Creek by late afternoon. The trail from here became rougher, rockier, with steep inclines that made me pause several times to catch my breath. The trees grew thicker, the underbrush denser. A cold wind began to blow, carrying the scent of wet leaves and moss. I felt a faint thrill, the kind that comes from stepping into the unknown, away from everything familiar. Around noon, I passed a narrow wooden bridge crossing a swift stream. The water was icy cold, rushing over smooth stones. I refilled my water bottle and paused again, enjoying the sound of the water. The forest here seemed older, darker, with thick moss covering the tree trunks. The trail here was slippery from recent rain, and I moved carefully. As afternoon approached, the sky turned gray with thick clouds rolling in from the west. I knew I had to make good time to the campsite or risk hiking in the dark. The trail climbed steadily up a ridge, the trees thinning out to reveal rocky outcrops. From here, I could see the tops of distant mountains, their peaks hidden in swirling mist. I felt a slight unease, a tension in the back of my neck. It was nothing specific, just the way the wind was picking up, how the clouds darkened. I tightened my jacket and kept moving. After an hour of hiking up the ridge, I reached the campsite, a small clearing with a fire ring and a few logs for sitting. It was nestled between tall pines, with a view down into a valley covered in thick forest. I was relieved to get here early enough to set up camp before dark. I pitched my tent carefully, making sure the rainfly was secure against the increasing wind. I gathered some dry wood nearby for a fire. The sky was now a heavy, leaden gray, and the first drops of rain began to fall. I started a small fire and cooked a simple meal of dehydrated stew, savoring the warmth. The rain became steady, drumming on the tent and turning the dirt ground into mud. Inside the tent, I listened to the sounds of the forest, the wind sighing through the branches, the steady patter of rain, the occasional snap of a twig. That night, I slept lightly, waking often to the wind's howl and the patter of rain. At one point, I heard a loud cracking sound outside, like a large branch breaking. I lay still, heart pounding, trying to convince myself it was just the storm. Eventually, exhaustion won, and I drifted back to sleep. Morning came gray and cold. The rain had stopped, but everything was soaked and dripping. I packed up slowly, careful not to slip on the wet ground. I ate a quick breakfast, drank more water, and set out back down the trail. The climb down was slippery and slow. The trail was muddy, and the rocks slick. At one point, I lost my footing and twisted my ankle badly on a hidden root. Pain shot through my foot, sharp and burning. I sat down, breathing hard, assessing the damage. The ankle was swollen and tender, but I could still put some weight on it. I wrapped it tightly with my bandage and used my trekking pole for extra support. The idea of spending another night in the wilderness was frightening. I considered calling for help on my emergency radio, but the signal was weak. I started moving slowly, each step sending sharp jolts through the ankle. The trail seemed longer, the forest darker. My body was tense, eyes constantly scanning for any danger. I knew I had to keep moving. Hours passed with agonizing slowness. The pain was relentless, but so was my determination. I forced myself to focus on breathing steadily, on placing my feet carefully. Around mid-afternoon, the clouds broke slightly, and shafts of sun pierced through the branches. I found a small stream and soaked my ankle in the cold water, trying to reduce swelling. The forest around me was eerily quiet. No birds, no rustling animals. I felt the isolation keenly. The idea that no one knew exactly where I was hit me hard. As evening approached, I finally reached a small dirt road. Relief surged through me. This road led back to the main gravel road and eventually to the trailhead. I called out softly, hoping someone might hear, but the forest swallowed my voice. Using the trekking pole, I limped down the road, step by painful step. After an hour, headlights appeared in the distance. A truck slowed as it approached. I waved weakly. The driver stopped, a local hunter returning from the woods. He helped me into the truck, drove me to the nearest town, and called for medical help. At the hospital, my ankle was x-rayed and found to be fractured. The experience left me shaken but alive. It taught me the raw power of nature and the importance of being prepared and cautious. Hiking alone means trusting yourself completely, knowing when to push forward and when to ask for help. The forest isn't a place for fear, but for respect. Respect for its beauty and its danger. My name's Kyle Thompson. Back in the summer of 2016, when I was 32, I took time off work to hike solo through a remote section of the Selway Bitterroot Wilderness in Idaho. I'd always been into hiking, nothing too extreme, but I liked long trails, backcountry silence, the kind of days where your phone's useless and the only sounds you hear are wind, birds, and the crunch of your boots. I worked in Seattle at the time doing software for a logistics company, and I had a few weeks of paid vacation. I wanted to use it differently that year. I'd been getting burned out from screens, meetings, and traffic. Something about the idea of being alone in the woods for a week started sounding really appealing. I didn't tell many people my plan, just left a note with my brother, Eric, about where I'd be. I even emailed him my route. I planned to hike about 80 miles total, split over 6 days, starting from a ranger station near Lowell and cutting deep into the Selway territory, following some old forest roads and unmaintained trails. I mapped it out using a topographical atlas and a few hiking blogs from people who'd been in that area. I felt confident about it. I had a solid pack with supplies, a GPS tracker, a reliable tent, and a weatherproof topographic map in case the electronics failed. I wasn't going in blind. I drove out early on a Saturday morning. The roads turned from paved to gravel before I even reached the trailhead, and the last 30 miles were slow. Tall pine trees lined the road. The occasional deer would dart across the path. I pulled into the trailhead parking lot around 2 p.m. It was completely empty. That wasn't unusual. This part of the state didn't get many hikers. It was wild, remote, quiet. I left my car and headed down the trail with everything on my back. My plan was simple: hike about 10 to 15 miles a day, sleep in my tent, and carry my food in bear-proof canisters. Water was plentiful along the trail thanks to small creeks, which I filtered before drinking. I kept my camera in the side pocket of my pack and took photos whenever the view opened up. Most of the time, I was surrounded by trees and dense brush. Occasionally, I'd come to a ridge and see the rolling green hills and distant mountains stretching out in every direction. The first day was smooth, warm, dry weather. I found a flat patch of ground beside a creek and set up camp for the night. The second day was harder. The trail narrowed, and I had to scramble over some fallen trees. The elevation gain was sharper than I remembered from the map. My legs burned on some of the steeper stretches. I didn't see anyone else out there. No hikers, no tire tracks, no footprints. Just the quiet of wind in the trees and the random scurrying of animals in the underbrush. I liked that solitude at first. That's what I'd come for. No one asking for anything. Just miles of trail and the weight of the pack on my shoulders. But that night, something started to feel off. I'd set up my tent near a large outcropping of granite, not far from a stream. I ate a dehydrated meal, hung my food, then zipped into the tent as it started getting dark. I lay there for a while, listening to the crickets, and eventually started drifting off. Then I heard footsteps. At first I figured it was an animal, a deer maybe, but they weren't fast, scattered footsteps like an animal would make. These were slow, heavy. One step, then a pause, then another. I lay perfectly still. I listened harder. No breathing, no rustling, just those deliberate footsteps. They stopped maybe 20 feet from my tent. I didn't move. I didn't even open my eyes fully. I just waited. Nothing happened after that. No sounds. Eventually, maybe an hour later, I fell back asleep. The next morning, I checked around the tent. No tracks. Nothing disturbed. I told myself it was probably a porcupine or a bear sniffing around. The soil was hard-packed, so tracks weren't easy to see. I moved on. Day 3 brought some of the most beautiful hiking I've ever done. A narrow trail wrapped around the side of a mountain, giving me views of a massive valley below. Forests stretched out in every direction. No buildings, no power lines, no signs of civilization. It felt like I was walking through land that hadn't changed in centuries. I came across an old fire tower that afternoon. It was abandoned and weathered. The metal steps were rusted and bent, and the wood inside the lookout cabin at the top had started rotting. I climbed halfway up, but didn't trust the structure enough to go all the way. I took a few pictures and then kept going. The map showed a fork in the trail ahead, one side leading west back toward the main route, and another leading deeper east into less traveled territory. I chose the eastern path. I wanted more isolation. That night, I camped in a hollow near some large boulders. The sun had set by the time I'd cooked dinner. I was more tired than usual and went to sleep without much thought. Around midnight, I woke up again. This time it wasn't footsteps. It was breathing, close, right outside the tent wall. Slow, heavy breathing, not animal-like, not panting or snuffling, just a steady inhale and exhale. Deep, calm, like someone standing right next to the tent. I didn't move. I could feel the weight of every breath in my chest. Whoever or whatever it was, they were inches away. I heard the faint crunch of leaves and then silence again. I lay there for hours, frozen, until daylight finally filtered through the nylon tent wall. When I crawled outside, the only sign of anything unusual was a single boot print in the dirt. It was clear, deeper than mine, maybe a size 12 or 13. It faced directly toward my tent. And that was it. No other tracks, just that one. At this point, I should have turned back, but I didn't. I was stubborn. I told myself it was nothing, that maybe someone else was hiking out here and stumbled onto my site by accident. It happens. Maybe they were lost or shy, or drunk. I hiked further. By the 4th day, things got harder. I was tired mentally more than physically. I kept thinking about the breathing, about how close it had been. The trail was overgrown, almost gone in places. I had to rely more on the topographic map than the GPS. The signal dropped off and on. The terrain was steeper than before. The trees were older, taller, denser. I didn't see much sunlight in the forest. Midday, I found a pair of rusted beer cans jammed between 2 rocks. They looked ancient, probably decades old. That was the only sign of people I'd seen since the tower. I followed the trail around a ridge and ended up in a narrow canyon-like cut in the terrain where the sun barely reached. Felt colder down there, wet. I slipped a few times on mossy rocks. That night, I pitched my tent in a dry patch under a tree canopy. I didn't even cook food. I just ate a protein bar and crawled into the sleeping bag. Again, I woke up to noises. but not right outside the tent. This time they were farther away, snapping branches, soft shuffling, like someone walking barefoot. At first it was faint, but it grew louder over time, circling slowly around the tent at a distance. I sat up and grabbed my knife. It wasn't much, a 4-inch fixed blade, but it was all I had. The noises stopped after maybe 30 minutes. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. At first light, I packed up and started hiking back. I didn't care that I was only halfway through my plan. I wanted out. I wanted to be around people again. I wanted to be somewhere with doors that locked. I hadn't seen a soul in days, but I knew, absolutely knew, I wasn't alone out there. As I hiked, I kept checking behind me. Every turn, every time the trail opened up. I watched the trees. I listened hard. Sometimes I thought I heard breathing again, or a footstep in the brush, but I could never confirm it. I started moving faster. Mid-morning, I came to a dry creek bed that wasn't on my map. I crossed it, slipping on a few loose rocks. When I reached the other side, I turned around, and that's when I saw something. High on the ridge I just crossed, maybe 150 feet away, was a man, just standing there, watching me. He was wearing a dark hoodie and jeans. No backpack, no hiking gear, no water, just standing with his arms at his sides. I couldn't see his face clearly, but I could tell he was staring straight at me. I froze. My legs wouldn't move. We stood like that for maybe 20 seconds. Then he stepped back into the trees and vanished. I ran. I didn't care about rolled ankles or twisted knees. I ran as fast as I could for hours. I didn't stop to eat or drink. I just kept moving. That night, I didn't pitch a tent. I found a rock overhang and curled up beneath it, knife in hand, shaking. By the next afternoon, I reached a forest road. It wasn't the one I'd entered on, but it didn't matter. I followed it for miles, until I finally saw a truck parked beside a locked gate. I sat down in the dirt nearby and waited. Maybe an hour later, a Forest Service worker showed up to check the gate. I flagged him down and told him I got turned around hiking. He gave me a ride back to the ranger station. The year was 2014. I was 27, and after months stuck in the city, glued to a desk job, I needed to get out. My legs craved the rough earth beneath them. My lungs begged for fresh air, untainted by exhaust fumes and office air conditioning. So I packed my backpack carefully one weekend in early September and drove 3 hours out of Salt Lake City, Utah, toward the Wasatch Range. I had chosen a trail on Mount Timpanogos, a well-known peak with several access points. I wanted something challenging but doable alone. The weather reports were clear, cool but sunny, perfect for hiking. I arrived early in the morning, the sun barely casting light over the valley. The trailhead was quiet, almost empty. I signed the logbook, tied my boots tightly, adjusted the straps of my pack, and began walking. The first few miles followed a gentle slope, lined by towering aspens and scattered pines. The air was crisp, sharp with the scent of pine needles and damp earth. My steps crunched softly on a bed of fallen leaves. The silence around me was profound except for the occasional bird call or rustle of a squirrel scurrying up a tree. I felt at peace. The rhythm of my breathing matched my steady pace. Around mile 3, the trail started climbing more steeply. The dirt path narrowed, and the trees thinned out as I gained elevation. I paused for water and a snack on a rocky outcrop with a stunning view of the valley below. The colors of autumn were beginning to show, the yellow of the aspens, the burnt orange of the shrubs. The sky was a deep blue, without a cloud in sight. After about 5 miles, the trail passed through a dense thicket of manzanita bushes and juniper trees. The scent here was earthy and sharp. The trail became less obvious, rocky underfoot and littered with loose gravel. My legs were starting to tire, but the quiet solitude was intoxicating. I pushed on. Around 7 miles in, I noticed something strange. The trail markers, small painted blazes on trees and rocks, seemed less frequent. The path forked and twisted more often. I paused, pulling out my map to check my route. According to the guidebook, the next landmark was a large boulder shaped like a broken pillar called the Sentinel. I scanned the surrounding area but saw nothing like that. I decided to keep moving forward, sticking to the most beaten path, trusting my sense of direction and the faint trail I could still see. The ground grew steeper, more uneven. I had to use my hands to steady myself climbing a steep rock slab. The air grew thinner, colder, and the wind started to pick up. By the time I reached the supposed location of the sentinel, there was no sign of it. I circled the area, checking carefully, but all I found were jagged rocks and scattered boulders, none matching the description. The sun was already descending behind the peaks, and I realized I had lost the trail somewhere along the last mile. My heart quickened, not from exertion, but from the growing realization that I was off course. I tried to remain calm, took a deep breath, and pulled out my compass. I set a heading for the trailhead, which lay roughly south. But when I moved in that direction, the terrain grew even more treacherous. Steep cliffs dropping off to the side, dense brush making progress slow. I had to turn back several times. The sun dipped below the horizon faster than I expected. Twilight was settling, and the chill deepened. I knew I couldn't just keep wandering blindly. I tried my phone for GPS, but there was no signal. No surprise, I was far from any towers. I stopped to assess. The temperature was dropping fast, and I wasn't prepared for an overnight stay. I had a small flashlight, a thin jacket, and some snacks, but no sleeping bag or tent. The woods around me seemed darker, the shapes of trees and rocks more ominous in the failing light. The silence had changed. It was no longer peaceful, but thick, heavy, almost suffocating. I forced myself to keep moving, telling myself I'd find the trail soon. I tried to retrace my steps to the last place I was sure of, but the landscape had become confusing. Trees looked similar, and the rocky ground was uneven and slippery in the dusk. Then I heard it, a faint noise, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. A snapping twig, not one under my foot, but somewhere off to the side. My breath caught. I froze, listening. The forest was still except for the soft rustle of leaves in the wind and that occasional snap. Then again, another twig cracked somewhere behind a thick bush. It was impossible. No one else was supposed to be on this trail this late. My mind raced through possibilities. An animal? But the sound was deliberate, like footsteps. I gripped my hiking pole tighter, scanning the shadows. The forest was growing darker. The thin beam of my flashlight didn't penetrate far. Every rustle seemed louder, every shadow a potential threat. I decided to keep moving downhill, towards where I thought the trailhead lay. The slope was steep, making my footing uncertain. My heart pounded, not just from the exertion but from the fear creeping in. The snapping sounds followed me, not constantly, but enough to keep my nerves frayed. Every time I stopped, the noises stopped. Every time I moved, they resumed. Whoever or whatever it was, they were tracking me. I tried to calm myself with logic. Maybe it was a deer or a mountain lion padding through the brush. Maybe a hunter out late. But the sound was too irregular and always behind me, never ahead. I realized I needed to make a plan. I couldn't keep wandering blindly downhill. The risk of falling or breaking something increased in the dark. I tried calling out, but the forest swallowed my voice. I decided to climb a tree to get a better vantage point and see if I could spot the trail or any other signs. I found a tall pine with low branches and started climbing, careful not to make noise. Once settled about 10 feet up, I shined my flashlight across the hillside. The moon was rising, casting a pale light. I could see the rough outline of the terrain, rocks, trees, bushes, but no trail. Then I saw it. A faint flicker of light, like a campfire, several hundred yards away, near the base of the ridge. I felt a mix of relief and caution. Maybe there were other hikers or campers there. If I could reach that spot, I might find safety. I climbed down carefully, listening again. The snapping noises had stopped. I moved quietly toward the flicker of light, using the moonlight to guide me. As I got closer, the smell of smoke hit me. With smoke, fresh and strong. The flicker was definitely a fire, but the area was empty, except for a small circle of stones with burnt wood inside. No people, no tents, Nothing except the fire pit and a few scattered belongings. An empty backpack, a water bottle, a pair of hiking boots. I scanned the area, uneasy now. Who had made this fire? Why was no one here? The woods around me felt heavier, oppressive in a way I couldn't explain. I considered staying by the fire for warmth and shelter, but a deeper feeling urged me to move on. Suddenly, I heard a voice. No words, just a shout or a scream far away, echoing through the trees. It was sharp and urgent, filled with panic. I froze. My mind raced again. Was someone else lost? Hurt? Or worse? The night was closing in fully now. I knew I couldn't stay still. I had to find the trail and get back. I headed toward where I thought the trailhead was on my map, using the stars and moon to orient myself. The snapping noises returned but farther away, disappearing into the dark. Hours passed as I stumbled through thick underbrush, slipping on wet leaves and rocks. My hands and knees were scratched, my clothes torn in places. My legs screamed from exhaustion. Finally, just as the sky started to lighten with dawn, I heard the unmistakable sound of running water, a small creek. I knew from the map that the trail crossed that creek a few miles from the parking area. Energized, I followed the sound, carefully picking my way through the woods. After what felt like forever, the trees thinned and I saw a worn dirt path ahead. Definitely the trail. I collapsed on a large rock beside the path, tears of relief streaming down my face. I wasn't sure how I had gotten so lost or what had followed me in the dark. The forest had kept its secrets. I rested for a few minutes, then started walking back toward the trailhead, my pace slow but steady. When I finally reached the parking lot, the morning sun was fully up, bathing everything in warm light. A couple of early hikers nodded as I passed, none knowing the ordeal I'd been through. I didn't stop until I was back in my car, doors locked, safe. That day, I learned how fragile safety can be in the wild, how quickly a simple hike can turn into something else. Nature doesn't care about your plans or your maps. It's indifferent and unforgiving. And sometimes, the scariest thing isn't some wild animal or legend, but the cold silence of being utterly alone, lost, and followed by shadows you can't explain. I never returned to that I was 39 the summer I decided to go hiking alone through a stretch of high country I hadn't explored before. It was July of 2016, and I'd been working nonstop the whole year. I lived just outside of Helena, Montana, and I had been planning this solo trip for almost 8 months. I had pored over maps, trail blogs, satellite images, and even scanned through old Forest Service reports. I wanted a long, quiet hike. Nothing fancy, just a full week away from people, phones, engines, schedules, and all the dull, constant hum of daily life. Just my boots, my pack, and the trees. The route I chose wasn't an official trail. It was a chain of old logging paths and game trails weaving through the southern edge of the Beaverhead Deer Lodge National Forest, wrapping around a jagged ridge behind a place called Elk Hollow. It wasn't particularly well-traveled, which was exactly what I wanted. No rangers, no signs, no tourists. A straight line through the wilderness, 10 days out, 10 back, with food drops at 2 planned caches. The area was known for grizzlies, but I'd camped in bear country before. I had spray, proper canisters, and experience. I wasn't worried. In fact, I'd never felt more prepared for anything in my life. I parked my truck at a dirt pullout about 4 miles off a back road that cut west from Townsend. From there, I loaded my gear, close to 65 pounds, and hiked in fast the first day, putting in almost 15 miles. It was warm but breezy, skies were clear, and I could smell pine sap and warm rock. The air up there had that dry mountain sharpness I loved. I made camp just after sundown in a flat patch between 2 fir groves. I saw deer that night and what I think was a fox. Slept deep. Day 2 was even better. I moved up into higher elevation, past a dry creek bed and onto a ridge that let me look down across the folds of the forest like an ocean of green. The trees looked endless. That's what I wanted. No cars, no other voices, just the sound of wind and the weight of the pack pressing into my hips. On the 3rd night, I pitched my tent on a little outcrop beneath the ridge. I remember that night clearly. I was sitting outside, just boiling water, and I noticed the wind had completely stopped. There was no sound at all, like the whole forest had suddenly turned off. It wasn't threatening, just strange. No birds, no rustling, nothing. I told myself it was just dusk settling in. But still, it was the first moment on that trip where I felt slightly off, like I was being watched. I woke up around 3 a.m. to what sounded like a single thump, like something had stepped on a log near the edge of my camp. I sat up and waited, didn't hear anything else. I had my bear spray in the tent vestibule and a knife next to me, but nothing else happened. I told myself it was probably a deer or an elk, maybe just an old branch falling. The silence stretched on again after that, and I eventually fell back asleep. The next day, I started moving into steeper terrain. The trail was more guesswork at that point, overgrown and faint. I followed animal tracks for hours and used my compass and GPS to keep my heading. I remember how thick the underbrush got, shoulder high in places, dense with ferns and fireweed. I had to stop every 20 or 30 yards to check that I was still on course. It was on that day that I found something strange. I was coming around a slope, thick with larch and old man's beard hanging in sheets from the branches, when I saw a shape up ahead. It was off the path, maybe 30 feet into the trees. At first, I thought it was a dead tree, but as I got closer, I realized it was an old tent. It had collapsed, partially torn, sun-bleached almost white. It didn't look recent. The tent was a two-person model, faded green. The poles were snapped, the fabric shredded. There was a broken camp chair nearby, and what looked like a rusted pot. I stepped closer, scanning the area, and saw a pack, sun-bleached and empty. No food, no gear. I could see mold and mildew on what was left of the straps. No shoes, no clothes, no sign of anyone. It looked like someone had been camped there years ago and then just disappeared. Creeped me out. It wasn't on any ranger log I had seen, and there were no signs or markers. I didn't touch anything, just took a mental note of the coordinates and moved on. The rest of that day, I had that same heavy feeling, like I wasn't alone. Every time I stopped, I'd hear small rustling, but never saw anything when I turned. I made camp early that night, more tucked in and near water. That night, I didn't sleep much. I kept thinking about that old tent and what could have happened there. Bears? Maybe, but it didn't look like an animal attack. It looked abandoned, forgotten. I started second-guessing my route. I was deep in now, at least 30 miles from the nearest road. The next 2 days were hard. The trail vanished entirely in parts, and I had to scramble over rock faces and push through thick timber stands. I fell once, nothing serious, but I twisted my ankle enough to make me cautious. I wrapped it with the ace bandage from my med kit and limped along at half my usual pace. I kept expecting to see more signs of people, but there was nothing. No wrappers, no old fire rings, no prints. It was the 6th night when things got worse. I had made camp in a steep valley, tucked beside a creek that cut down from the ridge above. There was a good spot just above the floodplain, level and dry. I'd been eating less by then, rationing because I was behind schedule. My ankle was slowing me down. I boiled water, ate some rice and jerky, and crawled into my bag early. I woke up sometime after midnight to a faint, rhythmic sound. Took a while to place it. A dull, soft knocking, like someone gently tapping wood together. I sat up, heart pounding. I listened. It would knock a few times, pause, then again. It sounded like it was coming from the trees just uphill from my tent. I stayed still for nearly 15 minutes, holding my breath between knocks. Then it stopped. Nothing after that. I lay back down, still fully dressed, and waited for the dawn. The next morning, I found nothing. No prints, no marks. I moved fast that day, pushing past the ridge and descending into a new basin. I had planned to swing south and follow an old washback toward my first cache drop, about 3 days away. I was exhausted, sore, and getting paranoid. That afternoon, I found a small patch of disturbed earth, a rough impression in the dirt. It looked like a large footprint, but not fresh. I couldn't tell if it was a person or an animal. It was wide, not deep, with loose edges. I marked it on my GPS and kept moving. That night, I set up camp in a small saddle between two rises. It was exposed, but I wanted the visibility. I wanted to see if anything was coming. I kept waking up every hour, scanning the dark outside my tent. Around 4 a.m., I heard it again. A soft, distant knocking. 3 knocks. Pause. Then 2 more. Then silence. When the sun finally rose, I packed up fast. My ankle throbbed constantly now. I was limping hard and barely making 4 miles a day. I rationed my water, moving from one seep to the next. I started thinking seriously about turning back, but that would take longer than going forward to the first food drop. The forest started changing after that. The trees were thinner, the underbrush more open. But I saw more signs, scratches on bark, broken branches high up. Once, I found a series of small cairns, piles of stones stacked deliberately along a narrow drainage. Each was about knee-high, spaced every 100 feet or so. They didn't look natural. I hadn't made them. They weren't on any map. That night, I didn't camp. I just kept walking until dark, then laid out my bag in a shallow depression, away from open ground. No fire, no light. I slept maybe an hour. In the early morning dark, I opened my eyes and saw a shape on the ridge above me. Just a silhouette. It wasn't moving, just standing, watching. I blinked, and it was gone. Maybe it had never been there. Maybe I was losing it. But I didn't sleep again. I pushed through the next 2 days like a ghost, barely eating. My limbs felt like wood. I wasn't even sure if I was on the trail anymore. Then I saw the cabin. It was half buried in brush, set into a low clearing. The wood was gray, the roof partially collapsed. It wasn't on my map, and I hadn't seen any mention of it online. I approached slowly, making noise. No answer. The door was off its hinges, and the inside was empty. Just a dirt floor, a few rusted cans, and a crumbling cot. Someone had once stayed there, long ago. Maybe the same person who had made those cairns. I left the cabin fast and didn't stop until nightfall. By the 9th day, I reached the edge of a small lake I'd marked as a backup water source. That was where I found the cache, barely. It had been dug up. The rocks I had piled on top were scattered. The container had teeth marks on it, big ones. Bears, probably. All the food was gone. I sat down and felt a kind of cold dread settle into my stomach. No food. I was 32 when it happened. I had just moved to Missoula, Montana after quitting my job in Dallas. The city life had burned me out. Long commutes, traffic noise, crowded sidewalks. I'd had enough of all of it. So I packed my things in December of 2019, rented a small apartment near the university in Missoula, and decided to take some time off for myself. I didn't have any long-term plans back then. I just knew I wanted peace and quiet and some fresh air. When spring rolled in, I got into the habit of hiking every weekend. At first, I stuck to the well-marked trails just outside town, places like the Rattlesnake Trailhead or Mount Sentinel. But the more I hiked, the more I wanted to go deeper. I started researching lesser-known routes, ones that didn't show up on the main websites or the tourist maps. I was looking for something quieter, something untouched, and I convinced myself I had enough experience to handle it. By late May, the snow was mostly gone from the mid-elevations, and I'd already done about a dozen solo hikes with no trouble. That's when I stumbled across an old forestry blog post about a trail called Iron Tooth Pass. The guy who wrote it said it hadn't been maintained since the early 2000s, and that the trail markers were almost all gone. But he also said the views from the top were some of the best in western Montana. That was all it took to get me hooked. The trail started in a part of the Lolo National Forest I'd never visited before. I printed out a copy of a topographic map from an archive site, downloaded GPS tracks from a hiker who had done it back in 2014, and marked a few points on my phone's offline map. The route was supposed to be about 18 miles round trip with a 3,500-foot elevation gain, climbing from a wide valley up through a pine-covered ridge, then through a narrow pass between 2 jagged cliffs. I left early on a Saturday morning in early June. I packed 3 liters of water, a filter pump, dehydrated meals, 2 protein bars, an emergency beacon, bear spray, and a change of socks. I had no plans to camp, I wanted to finish the hike in one long day and be back in Missoula before midnight. The drive took about 2 hours. I left my car parked near a gated forest road that was half overgrown with weeds and grass. There were no other cars around. No signs, no trash bins or bathrooms. Just a rusted metal sign bent backward with Iron Tooth Road, barely visible through the flaking paint. I double-checked my coordinates, made sure the GPS was working, slung my backpack over my shoulder, and started walking. The first 2 miles followed the remains of an old fire road. It was wide, flat, and easy. A few fallen trees blocked the way, but I just stepped over or around them. The sun was still low in the sky, filtering through the dense pine canopy. I could hear nothing but the wind brushing the branches and the occasional squirrel darting through the underbrush. About 3 miles in, the road disappeared into thick brush. That was expected. According to my map, the trail veered uphill at this point, following a small creek for about a mile before climbing sharply up the ridge. I found the creek easily enough. It was more of a trickle than anything else, but there was no clear trail. I bushwhacked alongside it for a while, stepping over wet moss and slick rocks. My boots got soaked early on, which annoyed me, but I didn't let it ruin my mood. The higher I climbed, the more difficult it became to find any hint of a trail. The slope steepened, and the ground was soft and uneven. Dead branches and dry pine needles crunched underfoot, and more than once I slipped and had to catch myself on a nearby tree. I stopped around mile 5 to catch my breath and eat a protein bar. My shirt was already damp with sweat, and mosquitoes buzzed constantly around my neck and ears. I remember thinking, this is harder than I thought. But I still felt strong. I'd done tougher climbs. I had water, food, and sunlight. I wasn't lost. I had the GPS track loaded on my phone and my backup compass in my pack. After another mile of climbing, I finally crested the ridge. The trees thinned out, and for a moment I could see the valley below stretching for miles. There was no sign of civilization, just forest and sky. I checked my location again. I was about halfway to the pass. From here, the trail was supposed to traverse a long, narrow ridge for several miles before reaching Iron Tooth. That's when things started to feel off. The first thing I noticed was the wind. Came suddenly, and it didn't match the air around me. It was cold, not just cool, cold. It cut through my shirt like ice, even though the sun was bright and strong. I looked around. Nothing seemed unusual. No clouds, no change in weather. But the cold wind kept coming in short bursts, like it was being pushed through a tunnel somewhere. I kept going. The trail, or what I hoped was the trail, followed a narrow line along the ridge, just wide enough for me to walk without stumbling. To my left, the slope dropped sharply into a forested canyon. To my right, the terrain climbed again toward the rocky spires of Iron Tooth. I could see the jagged cliffs in the distance, sharp, gray peaks like broken teeth. That's how the trail got its name, apparently. As I walked, I kept noticing strange things. Rocks that looked freshly disturbed, tree trunks with odd scratches, long, deep gouges that didn't look like anything a deer or bear would make. Once I saw a pair of hiking poles leaning against a stump, half covered in moss. They looked old, but not abandoned for years, maybe a season or two. There was no name or tag on them, just left there, as if someone had stopped for a break and never came back. Still, I didn't let it shake me. I told myself the scratches were nothing. The wind was a fluke. The poles were probably left behind by someone who turned back. But deep down, I started to feel something I hadn't felt on a hike in a long time. Unease. I reached the base of the pass just before noon. The cliffs loomed above me, steep and narrow. The trail was now little more than a game path, a faint, rocky line climbing between two walls of jagged stone. I took a long sip of water, tightened my boots, and started up. That's when everything started to go wrong. About 20 feet into the climb, I slipped. My foot landed on a patch of loose gravel and skidded out from under me. I fell hard onto my side and slid several feet before catching a root. My leg twisted under me, and a sharp jolt of pain shot up from my ankle. I lay there for a moment, trying to catch my breath. My heart was pounding. I sat up and tested the ankle. It wasn't broken, but it was bad. Swollen already. I could barely put weight on it without sharp pain. Hiking back 18 miles on this ankle would be slow, dangerous, even. I sat for nearly half an hour trying to decide what to do. I had enough food and water to stay the night, but I hadn't packed for that. The emergency beacon was in my pack, but I didn't want to hit it unless I had no other choice. I could still walk. I could still see my GPS location. I wasn't stranded. Not yet. I decided to go back. Climbing back down the pass was worse than going up. Every step sent pain up my leg. I had to go slow, using trees and rocks for support. By the time I got back to the base, the sun was starting to shift westward. I knew I had less than 7 hours of daylight left. I needed to make it back to the ridge before dusk. That was when I realized I hadn't seen any animals in hours. No birds, no squirrels, no distant calls, just wind and silence. The kind of silence that makes your ears ring. The air felt wrong, heavy, still cold in patches. I pressed on, limping slowly back along the ridge, and then I saw something that stopped me in my tracks. There was a jacket, a gray hiking jacket draped over a low bush. It hadn't been there when I passed earlier. I was sure of it. I would have noticed it. It was too clean, too out of place. I walked over slowly. The jacket was damp, like it had been left out overnight. No name on the tag, nothing in the pockets. That's when the smell hit me. Not from the jacket, from somewhere nearby. A heavy, sour, metallic smell, like blood, old blood. I backed away. My instincts screamed at me to leave, but I still didn't hit the beacon. I don't know why. Maybe pride, maybe denial. I just wanted to get out. I hiked faster despite the pain, limping, stumbling, using my trekking poles like crutches. I checked my phone again and saw that the GPS had stopped tracking. No signal, no saved route, just a blinking dot that hadn't moved in 15 minutes. I checked my compass. North was still north. I turned and kept walking, but something felt wrong. The ridge looked the same, but the trees were different. Denser, thicker. I passed a rock outcrop I swore I hadn't seen before. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the ground. The temperature dropped sharply, and I started to shiver. My ankle throbbed with every step. It was past 6 p.m. when I realized I was lost. Truly lost. No GPS, no trail, just endless trees and a growing darkness. I kept moving. I was 31 when I decided to take that trip. It was early fall, late September of 2017. The leaves in the mountains of northern Idaho had already started to turn, and I had a 4-day weekend that lined up just right. My name doesn't matter for this, but I'll say I worked in Spokane back then, lived alone, had a routine, and didn't have a lot of people checking in on me. That was part of the reason I hiked in the first place. Being out there gave me a kind of peace I couldn't find in cities. That, and I hated gyms. I liked pushing myself physically without machines or noise or other people. I had done a lot of the trails in the Selkirk Mountains before, but this one was supposed to be different. It was called the Pine Ridge Traverse, a 19-mile point-to-point route that cut through a long stretch of forest between two Forest Service roads. The trailhead started near an old decommissioned fire lookout and ended at a primitive campground that no one used past Labor Day. There was nothing really famous about the trail. It wasn't in any guidebook, but I had read about it on a forum. Some guy who went by Grizmitch had posted a trip report from 2014. His pictures showed golden larch trees and big open ridges, and his post said something like, asterisk, "It's a lonely hike, but you won't regret it." Asterisk, that was enough for me. I parked my car on a Friday morning just before 9 a.m., locked it up at the south trailhead, and started walking north. I had my pack loaded light, just one overnight planned, and I'd left some food and water in a cooler in the trunk for the end of the hike. I wasn't in any rush. The weather was clear, a crisp 55 degrees, and the sky had that deep blue color it only gets in the fall. There weren't many bugs, no chance of snow, and the forecast said nothing but sunshine. I had my Garmin, my paper map, and everything I needed. For the first few hours, it was perfect. The trail was narrow and overgrown in places, but I didn't mind. There were some steep switchbacks, but then it opened up along a high ridge with views stretching all the way to Montana. I didn't see a soul, just a few deer tracks, some bear scat that looked a few days old, and that was it. I stopped for lunch around noon, sitting on a log, watching a hawk circle over a dead tree. I remember thinking how quiet it was. So quiet it almost felt fake. The kind of silence where your ears start ringing just to fill the space. Around 2 p.m., I reached a fork in the trail that wasn't on my map. That threw me off. There was a faded wooden post driven into the ground with no markings on it. To the left, the trail curved down into a valley. To the right, it climbed back up toward another ridgeline. My map showed only one main trail, no forks. I stood there for a while, trying to figure it out. My instinct said stay left, because the original trail was supposed to keep hugging the ridge for a while longer. But when I looked at the terrain ahead, the left path dipped down sharply and looked heavily forested. I knew from my map that the main trail should gradually lose elevation, but this drop was fast and steep. Then I remembered something from that forum post. I pulled it up again on my Garmin, which I had downloaded for offline use. Mitch had written, asterisk, there's a fork halfway that looks like a shortcut. Don't take it. Stick to the ridge. Asterisk. I took the right path. That was the first real mistake. Maybe not taking the fork would have saved me from what happened next, or maybe not. It's hard to know. The trail to the right felt normal at first. Narrow, sure, but still visible and packed down enough to follow. I figured the left fork must have been the shortcut, like Mitch said, and I was on the main route. The trail climbed a little and then leveled off, weaving through tall pines and clusters of firs. I walked for another hour, maybe longer. Then the trail got fainter. It wasn't sudden, just subtle. 1 minute it was a clear footpath, the next it was like a deer trail. Still visible, just harder to follow. By 4 p.m., I was getting that creeping feeling in my gut. The one you get when something's off, but you don't want to admit it yet. I checked my GPS, but the signal had gone spotty. The trees were dense, and I couldn't get a clear view of the sky to orient myself. I tried my compass and compared it to my printed map, but the terrain didn't match. The ridgelines were wrong. I was definitely off trail. That's when I realized I hadn't seen a blaze or trail marker in over an hour. I didn't panic right away. I'd done some bushwhacking before. I figured I could retrace my steps back to the fork. I turned around, trying to follow my own footprints, but the forest floor was covered in dry needles and moss. Nothing held a print. I walked back the way I thought I'd come, but after 20 minutes, I came to a small clearing I didn't recognize. That's when my stomach really dropped. I stood there, turning in slow circles, trying to match the trees to something I'd seen earlier, but nothing looked familiar. I kept moving, thinking maybe the trail was just a little farther ahead or behind. I covered another quarter mile, maybe more, but all I found were trees. No trail, no markers, no path. By the time I admitted I was lost, it was already 5 p.m. The sun was lower, the light turning gold through the canopy. I knew I had maybe 2 hours before it got dark, maybe less in this dense forest. My brain started running faster. What did I know? Stay put if you're lost. Make yourself visible. I climbed up a little hill to try to get cell service, but there was nothing. I tried my Garmin again, signals still bouncing. I looked for a spot to camp for the night. I found a flat patch under some hemlocks, laid out my ground tarp and sleeping bag, and gathered some dry sticks for a fire. I had a lighter and some fire starter tabs, and after 15 minutes I had a small fire going. The heat was comforting, but my nerves were on edge. I ate a cold meal from a pouch and sipped some water, trying not to drink too much. That night was the longest I've ever experienced. The forest came alive with sounds. Twigs snapping, leaves rustling, branches creaking. Every noise felt close. Every shadow looked like something waiting. I didn't sleep more than a few minutes at a time, always jerking awake with a dry mouth and a racing heart. The next morning, I tried again. I packed up early and picked a direction that felt downhill, thinking I could follow a drainage or creek out of the area. I walked for hours, still no sign of a trail. Around mid-morning, I found a dry stream bed and started following it. It twisted and dipped, hemmed in by steep sides, but it was something. That's when things started to go wrong physically. My legs were sore, my pack was digging into my shoulders, and the silence was starting to wear me down. My water was running low. I had a Sawyer mini filter, so I just needed to find flowing water, but the stream bed stayed dry. Not even a puddle. Around noon, I slipped on a patch of damp moss and fell hard onto my left side. My hip took most of the impact, and I felt a jolt shoot up my spine. I didn't break anything, but I bruised my ribs bad. It hurt to breathe deep. I sat there for a long time, just staring at the sky through the trees, trying not to cry. Eventually, I kept moving. I told myself I'd find water, then find a clearing, then try the GPS again. But the forest stretched on, unchanged. I was walking in circles. I knew it deep down. The sun moved across the sky, but every direction looked the same. I kept climbing ridges hoping to see something. Anything. A road, a cabin, even power lines. But there was nothing, just trees. That night, I didn't make a fire. I was too tired. I laid in the dark, stomach growling, ribs aching, ears straining at every noise. Something big moved through the trees around midnight. I never saw it, just heard it crashing through the undergrowth maybe 100 feet away. I held my breath until it passed. The next day, I found water, a thin trickle running down some rocks. I filtered it slowly, drank as much as I could, and filled both bottles. Tasted like earth and pine needles, but it saved me. I followed that trickle downstream, and by mid-afternoon it joined a bigger stream. That was my lifeline. For the next 2 days, I followed that stream through the forest. I rationed my food, 2 energy bars a day, some dried fruit. My body was wearing down. My feet were blistered, and my skin felt raw. I stopped sweating. I started talking to myself just to hear a voice. My GPS stayed dead. The signal never came back. On the 4th night, I heard something new, man-made. A low drone in the distance. A motor. I scrambled up a slope and saw a break in the trees. Through it, I saw a road. A real gravel road, cutting through the trees maybe a 1/4 mile away. I laughed out loud. It sounded crazy in the quiet. I made it to the road by nightfall. I limped along it in the dark for over an hour before I saw headlights. A Forest Service truck came up over the hill and stopped. The driver, an older guy in his 60s, stepped out and looked at me like I was a ghost. I looked like hell, dirt-caked, sunburned, eyes wild. I told him I'd been lost for 4 days. He didn't ask for details. He just told me to sit down and handed me a bottle of water. They drove me to a rain. I was 39 when it happened. The year was 2013. I'd taken a solo hiking trip through the western part of Colorado, close to the Utah border, not too far from Grand Junction. I was coming off a few months of work stress, and I had this habit of disappearing into the backcountry whenever life got a little too loud. I wasn't exactly an expert hiker, but I'd been doing it enough times to know how to pack, how to navigate, and how to manage basic emergencies. At least that's what I thought. This trip started like any other. I parked my pickup at a small dirt pullout along a quiet Forest Service road. The trailhead wasn't marked, and that's what I liked about it. I'd read about it in a forum post a few years earlier. Some guy had written a rambling post about a forgotten canyon system that branched off into a few forks. No name on a map, just left fork, tall ridge, natural stone gate, dry stream bed, that kind of thing. It wasn't an official trail, but it was public land, and I wasn't breaking any laws. It was early September, warm in the day, cold at night, perfect for hiking. My pack weighed around 38 pounds. I had food for 4 days, a hammock, tarp, sleeping bag, purification tabs, and a basic first aid kit. No firearm, just a long knife strapped to my leg and a small bear spray can clip to my belt. I left the truck around 8:30 in the morning. The sun was already hot, but the air still felt fresh. The first couple of miles went fast. The land was dry scrub, red dirt, scattered juniper, and occasional clusters of cottonwood. I followed a faint trail that eventually disappeared. That was expected. The terrain started dipping slowly, and I dropped down into a shallow wash. Loose gravel and sandy mud from older floods made each step a little slippery. The walls on either side slowly grew taller. I remembered the guy on the forum saying, "Once the walls get to 20 feet high and curve right, you're close to the natural stone gate." Sure enough, the bend came, and right there, two massive boulders, almost upright like doorposts. One leaned toward the other just slightly, and the sky peeked through the space between. It looked like something that should be in a museum. I stopped for a snack and drank half a liter of water. My plan was to get deep into the backcountry by noon, set up a temporary camp, then move further in the next day. I didn't expect to see a soul out there. This area wasn't even on the radar for most hikers. I liked it that way. After the gate, the canyon split in two, left and right. The forum post said take the left. Left fork gets steep and ugly, but leads to a hidden ridge with open flat land behind. I did exactly that. The walls narrowed quickly. I had to take my pack off to squeeze through in some places. The shade made the air cooler, but I was sweating hard. It got steep just like the post said. I had to use both hands to climb over dry boulders and ledges. I reached the ridge after another hour. When I looked back, I realized how isolated it was. There was no way to see my old route once I crossed over. Behind the ridge, just like the post described, was a large, flat, dry stretch of earth. Small rocks scattered everywhere, patches of grass and cactus. It felt like a small plateau, enclosed by more canyon walls in the distance. There was no trail, but the land was easy to walk. That's when things started to feel strange, though not in any supernatural way. Just off. There were tire tracks, old, but still visible. Not wide like a truck, more like ATV tracks. That wouldn't have meant much on its own, but this place was boxed in by rocks. I couldn't see how someone could get a vehicle up here. There were no roads, no ramps, no gentle inclines, just sheer walls and narrow cracks. Maybe someone had come up a different way years ago, but it bugged me more than it should have. Still, I was committed. I followed the edge of the flat land, looking for a good place to hang my hammock between two sturdy junipers. I found a decent spot near a wide bend where the land sloped into another shallow wash. There were some broken branches nearby, almost like someone had been clearing space. That should have been another red flag, but I was too focused on setting up before dark. Camp went up fast. Hammock between two trees, tarp overhead. I boiled water and ate dehydrated chili with crackers. The silence was deep. No birds, no insects, just wind. I tried to enjoy the peace, but something about the air felt tense. The best way I can describe it, like when you're in a room and you know someone was just there, even if you didn't see them. I slept with one ear open that night. No fire, just my headlamp and a backup battery pack for my phone, which had no signal since midday. Around 1:30 in the morning, I heard something, a steady crunch in the dirt. One step, then another, then silence. I gripped the knife under my pillow and held my breath. I lay there for almost 20 minutes, heart pounding, but nothing else happened. Could have been a deer or a mountain lion or even just a falling branch. But it sounded like a footstep, heavy and slow, not four-legged. The next morning, I broke camp before sunrise. I wanted to get further up the ridge and down into the next canyon. I didn't want to spend another night in that same spot. I packed everything in silence and made my way toward the far end of the flatland, where it sloped down into what looked like another wash. The terrain got trickier. The slope was loose and full of ankle-twisting rocks. I slipped more than once. That's when I saw the remains. They weren't fresh, half covered in dust and dry grass. A metal frame, rusted, looked like an old off-road motorbike. The engine was missing, but the handlebars and part of the wheel were still intact. It must have been out here for years, but that wasn't the part that got me. Nearby, about 30 feet away, was a backpack, shredded, faded red fabric. One strap looked almost melted. I walked closer, slow and careful. I could see sun-bleached clothes tangled in it. Then I saw the boot, just one, torn laces, half buried in rock. There were no bones that I could see, no ID, but there was a smell, faint, like rot mixed with animal scat. the kind of smell that doesn't go away easily. I didn't touch anything. I backed away and kept walking. My stomach was tight. I couldn't shake the feeling that something bad had happened there. Not a simple accident. Something else. The canyon beyond was tighter than I expected. Steep walls close in. The kind of place sound bounces weird. I thought about turning back, but I didn't want to pass that spot again. So I went forward. I hiked for hours. The sun was brutal. I rationed my water carefully. Around mid-afternoon, I found a small overhang with shade. I sat down, took off my boots, and let my feet breathe. That's when I saw the mark. On the underside of the rock, carved deep, were the numbers September 6th, 02. Below that, the letters DB. Nothing else. No initials that matched mine. But the date, that was 11 years ago to the day. I stared at it for a long time. Then I put my boots back on and kept moving. That night, I slept without setting up camp. I just lay under the stars in my bag. No tarp, no hammock, knife in hand. Every sound made my nerves twitch. The wind picked up and howled through the canyon like a scream. I didn't sleep more than an hour. On the third day, I tried to find a way out. I followed the canyon until it forked again. I took the left path, again stupidly trusting the idea that left was better. This one narrowed until I was walking sideways. Then it opened into a dry basin with dead trees and cracked mud. That's where I found the shack. It wasn't large, maybe 10 by 10 feet, built from old lumber and corrugated metal. Half collapsed. The door was gone. Inside were broken tools, cans, glass bottles, and a ripped sleeping bag. I stepped in carefully, looking around. It reeked of decay and mold. Something about it felt wrong, like it had been left in a hurry. There were scratch marks on the inside wall. Not animal. These were vertical, uneven, like someone had clawed at it. I turned around to leave, and that's when I heard it. Not footsteps this time. A whistle. High, short, clear. From behind the shack, maybe 20 yards off. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. Then it happened again. One short whistle. Then nothing. I turned and ran. I didn't care about water or food or landmarks. I just ran back the way I came. My legs burned. My shoulders ached. I scraped both hands trying to climb a ledge I'd come down the day before. I didn't stop until I reached the stone gate again. When I finally saw my truck, late that evening, I dropped to my knees. My throat was dry, and I could barely swallow. I got in, locked the doors, and didn't drive for 10 minutes. I just sat there, staring at the trees. I told myself I imagined most of it. Maybe I did. But a month later, I mailed a copy of the coordinates and a note to the sheriff's office in Mesa County. My name's Daniel Price. I was 34 years old when this happened, back in late September of 2016. I was living in Idaho Falls at the time, working as a mechanic. I had always been into hiking, but I didn't get to go as much as I used to. Life had caught up to me. Bills, long hours, and just general burnout from everything. That year had been especially rough. My girlfriend had moved out in April, and the shop I worked at was understaffed, so I was basically living there 6 days a week. I hadn't taken any time off for over a year. By the time fall rolled around, I had finally built up enough paid leave to take a full week off. I didn't want to fly anywhere. I didn't want to stay in a hotel or deal with crowds or traffic. I just wanted quiet, space, and nature. I pulled out my maps, checked the gear I still had from my younger years, and started planning a solo trip in the Caribou-Targhee National Forest, somewhere far away from popular trails. I didn't want to be around people. I just wanted to clear my head and walk. I settled on an area about 2 hours east of Idaho Falls, near the Wyoming border, not far from where the Snake River twists southward into the valleys. I found a lesser-known trail that followed an old service road for a few miles before dropping into a network of old forest paths and game trails. My plan was simple: hike out with everything I needed, stay 4 nights in different spots, and hike back on the 5th day. The morning I left was cool but not too cold, and the sky was mostly clear. I parked my truck in a small gravel pull-off, well off the road, where 2 Forest Service roads met. I hadn't seen a single car for the last 20 miles, And once I locked the truck and started walking, the silence was like a wave. No engines, no voices, no ringing phones. Just the wind moving through the trees and the sound of my boots on dirt. The first few hours were easy, following the old road as it wound through scattered pine and aspen trees. I had a paper map tucked in my jacket pocket, and I kept checking it just to stay on course. My GPS watch was working fine, but I didn't trust batteries for long trips like this. After a few miles, I passed a rusted-out old water tank and a decaying wooden shed, probably built for logging crews decades ago. It was falling apart, covered in moss and lichen, and looked like it would cave in if you sneezed too hard near it. By mid-afternoon, I had dropped off the road and was working my way down a narrow trail that followed a dry creek bed. The trees grew denser down there, and the ground was layered with fallen needles and soft dirt. I found a flat spot near a bend in the creek bed and set up my tent. I had everything I needed: lightweight tent, sleeping bag, stove, a bare canister full of food, water purifier, and an emergency beacon just in case. I wasn't worried. I'd done solo hikes before and I was being careful. That first night was quiet. I made rice and tuna on the stove, listened to the wind, and watched the sky turn from blue to deep purple to black. I thought I might sleep badly, like I sometimes do the first night in the backcountry, but I was out within minutes and didn't wake up until the sun hit the tent around 7 the next morning. The second day was harder. The trail I was following was no longer marked. I had a general idea of the direction I wanted to go, east and slightly north, and I could follow the ridgelines and natural clearings to stay on course. I wasn't bushwhacking exactly, but it was slow going. I had to climb over fallen logs, step carefully through thick underbrush, and sometimes double back when a path ended in a thicket of dense trees. Around mid-afternoon, I reached a flat open area that looked like an old campsite. There was a circle of rocks, probably from an old fire pit, and a few pieces of broken glass in the dirt. I dropped my pack, stretched out my back, and took out some food. I remember this part clearly because it was the first time I had that little feeling, like I wasn't completely alone. I looked around the trees for signs of wildlife, tracks, droppings, movement, but saw nothing. The trees were tall and close together, and the ground was soft and quiet. Still, the feeling lingered. I shrugged it off, packed up my things, and moved on. By the time I found my next campsite, a small rise overlooking a long, sloping valley, the feeling was gone, replaced by exhaustion and hunger. That night, things started to shift. I was lying in my sleeping bag, halfway asleep, when I heard something. Not close, but not far either. It was a kind of rhythmic sound, like someone dragging a stick through leaves. At first, I thought it was a deer or maybe an elk, but the sound didn't fit. It wasn't movement between trees. It was movement along the ground, slow and steady, then stopping, then starting again. It circled, moved further away, then came closer. I stayed still, heart pounding, listening. I turned off my headlamp and waited in the dark. After a while, the sound stopped, and all I could hear was the wind again. I didn't sleep well after that. The third day, I considered turning back. I wasn't scared exactly, but I was uneasy, and I still had a long way to go. But I told myself it was probably just an animal passing through. Maybe a bear or a moose. They wander at night. Still, I started paying more attention. I looked for tracks. I checked behind me more often. I made sure my bear spray was close. As I moved deeper into the forest that day, I started noticing strange things. The first was a tree, maybe 30 feet tall, that had been stripped of bark in a long vertical line. Not the kind of scratching that bears make, but like someone had taken a blade and peeled a strip clean off from top to bottom. The wood underneath was pale and smooth. I walked past it, not stopping long. The second was a pile of rocks, perfectly balanced in a stack about chest high. It was just off the trail I was following, and there were no other stones nearby. It didn't look like a cairn or a marker. It looked like something someone had done with too much time on their hands. I walked around it, gave it space. By the time the sun began to lower, the trees had thickened again, and I couldn't find a good clearing. I finally settled on a sloped spot near a fallen log. Not ideal, but flat enough to sleep on. That night, I built a small fire, my first of the trip, just to feel a little more grounded. I cooked, sat for a while, and then crawled into my bag. The sounds started again, closer this time. It was that same dragging noise, but mixed with it were soft, irregular steps, like something walking barefoot. Not heavy like boots or hooves, but not light either. I lay there, still as possible, holding my breath. I had my knife in one hand and my headlamp ready in the other. The sounds circled my tent, slowly, steadily. Then they stopped. I waited a full hour before I even moved. When I finally turned on the light, I saw nothing. I didn't sleep again that night. The fourth day, I made a decision. I was going to cut the loop short and start heading back toward the truck. My nerves were frayed, and I didn't want to spend another night in those woods. I started moving west, using my map and compass to adjust my path. But sometime around noon, I realized I had made a mistake. The terrain didn't match the map. The hills were steeper than they should have been, and the stream I was trying to follow wasn't where it should be. I kept adjusting my course, but things weren't adding up. I checked my GPS, and it wouldn't connect, just a frozen screen. I tried not to panic. I told myself I had food, I had shelter, I had time. But every step started to feel wrong. Every clearing looked the same. I stopped recognizing features. It was like the forest had rearranged itself around me. The silence pressed down harder than ever. Even birds were gone. Late in the afternoon, I stumbled into a narrow clearing and found something that stopped me cold. A small fire pit with the ashes still warm. There were fresh boot prints in the dirt, heading north. I called out instinctively, even though I had promised myself not to. Of course, no one answered. I followed the tracks for maybe half an hour before they vanished into a patch of dead leaves. No direction, no trail, just gone. I was left standing in a dense patch of woods with the light beginning to fail. I didn't want to sleep out in the open, but there were no other options. That night was the worst. I built a fire again, bigger this time. I kept my knife and spray next to me, and I didn't go in the tent. I sat by the flames for hours, staring into the trees, hearing the sounds return. This time they didn't circle. They stopped just beyond the firelight and stayed there. I couldn't see anything, just the shapes of trees and the glint of old branches. But I knew something was there, watching, waiting. I barely moved. My eyes burned, my legs cramped, but I stayed put, too afraid to lie down. I don't know when I finally passed out, but I woke to cold gray light and a half-dead fire. My body ached, my mouth was dry, and there were marks in the dirt. Not footprints, drag marks. Something had been close, within a few feet of me, closer than anything had come before. That morning, I didn't even eat. I packed up as fast as I could and started walking. I didn't care about direction anymore. I just wanted to move, to get out. I was 34 years old in the summer of 2013 when I took a solo hiking trip into the northern section of the Bitterroot Range, near the Idaho-Montana border. I'd been hiking and camping for over a decade by then, always with friends or in groups. This time, I wanted to go alone. I told myself I needed it like a reset button. At the time, I was working full-time as a maintenance supervisor at a packaging warehouse in Boise. Long shifts, noisy machines, people always needing something from me. I felt like my brain was buzzing even on my days off. So I picked a 4-day stretch in mid-July, packed my gear, printed a topographic map, loaded up the Jeep, and drove 5 hours north to the trailhead. I parked at a spot just off Highway 93, a gravel turnout beside a ranger sign that was half-eaten by rust. The trail was called Otter Ridge Trail, and it twisted about 16 miles into the hills. The plan was simple: hike in for a day and a half, find a quiet place to set up camp, spend 2 nights there, then hike back out on the 4th morning. I didn't tell many people where I was going. My cousin Carl knew. I'd mentioned it at a barbecue 2 weeks earlier, and I texted my ex-girlfriend Megan on the drive up, just something quick like, hiking solo for a few days, North Bitterroots, back Friday. She didn't reply, but I didn't expect her to. I guess I wanted someone to know where I'd be, just in case. The trail was narrow but clear that first morning. The forest was dense with Douglas fir and western larch, and in the spots where the trees broke apart, I could see the silver spine of the mountains ahead. I made good progress that day, probably 8 or 9 miles before stopping for the night. I found a flat space beside a creek, laid out my tent, cooked instant noodles on my small propane stove, and fell asleep to the sound of flowing water and wind through the pine needles. Nothing strange happened that first night. The next day, I woke up early, boiled water for coffee, and broke camp. I hiked another 4 or 5 miles by late afternoon and found a small bluff above a valley, a spot that looked out over green rolling trees and way off in the distance, a sharp ridge I couldn't name. The air smelled like sun-warmed bark and dry dirt. I dropped my pack and decided to make this my main camp. It was peaceful, exactly what I'd wanted. I boiled lake water, filtered it, ate a pouch of dehydrated beef stew, and leaned back on a rock. No cell signal, no voices, no engines, just the breeze and the birds. But that night, something started to feel off. I fell asleep around 9, just as the sky went navy blue. Sometime in the early morning, maybe 2 or 3 a.m., I woke up to a sound. At first I thought it was a branch snapping. Not unusual. Then I heard what sounded like footsteps. Not animal footsteps, but steady, deliberate crunches on dry leaves. One after the other. Then silence. Then 2 more steps. Then silence again. I stayed frozen in my sleeping bag. I didn't unzip it. I didn't move. I just lay there with my ears wide open. I listened hard for minutes, maybe longer. Eventually, nothing. Just the wind and night insects. Maybe a deer. Maybe something else. I don't know. I forced myself to breathe normally, but I didn't fall back asleep for a long time. The next morning, everything looked normal. I got up and checked the area around my tent. No boot prints, no broken branches, nothing looked touched. I told myself I imagined it. Sound travels strangely in the mountains. Maybe a raccoon or some other critter had walked nearby. Still, the feeling didn't go away. I considered hiking out that morning, cutting the trip short. But then I figured, I came all this way, and I was probably just overreacting. I stayed. I spent that whole day sitting around the bluff. I collected dry sticks for firewood. I read the same paperback I'd brought on other hikes, an old Clive Cussler novel. I wrote a couple lines in my small notepad. I didn't venture too far from camp. Something about the trees just beyond the ridge felt like they were watching me. Not in a supernatural way, not like a movie, just awareness. I can't explain it right. That night, I didn't sleep well. I kept waking up. No sounds like the night before, just a sense of unease that kept crawling up my back like spiders. I checked my watch a dozen times between midnight and dawn. I decided to hike out the next morning. When I started packing up, I noticed something I hadn't seen the day before. It wasn't huge, just strange. Near the base of a tree about 30 feet from my tent, the bark was scraped off in a wide vertical line, maybe 5 feet tall, 2 hands wide. Fresh wood showed underneath. I squatted down to look at it, touched the edge. It wasn't weathered. This had been done recently. Could have been an animal. Bears will do that sometimes. Marking territory, sharpening claws, I'm not sure. But I didn't see any bear scat. Didn't hear any heavy movement in the area. My mind started going down roads I didn't want to follow, so I zipped up my bag, stuffed it in the frame, and started down the trail. By late morning, I'd covered 3 or 4 miles. My legs felt strong, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I kept looking behind me every 10 minutes. I tried to remind myself that I'd hiked this trail that it was safe, that I was being paranoid. But the deeper I got into the trees, the worse I felt. Around mid-afternoon, I found something that stopped me cold. It was off-trail, maybe 15 feet into the woods. I wouldn't have noticed it unless the sunlight caught it just right. A glint of something metallic. I walked closer. It was a rusted metal canteen, dented, half buried in the dirt. Beside it, a torn piece of faded red nylon. I looked around, just forest. I picked up the canteen. It had no markings, no stickers, nothing personal. I looked harder and found more. A weathered hiking boot, overgrown with moss. A cracked headlamp, all old, maybe 10 years or more, but clearly left by someone. No bones, no clothes, no tent, no gear. just these scattered bits like someone had vanished mid-hike. I didn't know what to do. Part of me thought I should mark the spot, maybe come back with someone, report it, but another part of me, stronger, told me to leave. Right then, I stuffed the canteen in my pack and got back on the trail. I didn't stop again until sunset. That night, I didn't set up a tent. I didn't even eat. I found a thicket with good cover about 2 miles from the trailhead, and I lay down on my pad with my knife out. I kept the fire small. My hands were shaking and I couldn't stop scanning the trees. My ears were dialed up to full. I didn't sleep at all. At dawn, I got up and hiked the last 2 miles out. Every step felt like I was being watched. The trail twisted through dense firs and switchbacks, and each bend felt like it would reveal something I didn't want to see. When I finally saw the Jeep through the trees, I almost ran. I drove back to Boise without stopping. No music, no gas station snacks. Just white lines and headlights all the way home. I kept the canteen. For a while, I thought about taking it to the Rangers. But what would I say? That I found an old boot and a rusty bottle out in the woods? It wasn't evidence of anything, just old junk. But it didn't feel like junk. A few months later, I was reorganizing my gear in the garage when I decided to look up missing hiker reports for the Bitterroot area. I found one from 2003. A man in his early 40s, last seen heading into the same section of trail. He was never found. Name was Mark Kessler. The report said he was experienced, in good health, used to solo hikes. I stared at that page for a long time. I never went back to that area. I still hike, but only in groups, only on well-trafficked trails. I tell people exactly where I'm going and when I'll be back. I carry an emergency beacon now. I've never had another experience like that, but sometimes, when I'm trying to fall asleep, I hear footsteps on dry leaves. Not close, but steady, deliberate. Somewhere in the woods, someone watched me walk by and let me leave. That thought keeps me up sometimes more than any ghost story ever could. It was the summer of 2016 when I decided to take a solo hiking trip through the eastern edge of the Sawatch Range in central Colorado. I was 37 at the time, living in a small rental apartment just outside of Denver. Life had been pulling me in too many directions: work stress, relationship mess, debt piling up, the usual weight you carry when things start spinning just a little too fast. I needed a break from it all. I thought maybe a week alone in the mountains would help clear my head. I'd done plenty of hiking before, even a few solo treks, but this one I had planned to be a little more challenging. Not dangerous, not extreme, just something longer, a bit more remote. I picked a trail I had never done before, part of the Colorado Trail that runs through the San Isabel National Forest. It was around 38 miles of alpine trail between 2 small trailheads, with a few thousand feet of elevation gain and some high passes. I planned to take it easy, maybe 4 days of hiking, 3 nights camping. I packed what I thought I needed: a good tent, enough food, a water filter, bare canister, GPS, and a map. I also brought my phone, although I knew signal would drop within an hour of hiking in. I left a printed itinerary with my sister in case anything went wrong. She knew when to expect a call from me. That was the plan. I started out early on a Monday morning, parked my car just outside the trailhead near the small town of Buena Vista. The air was cool, the sky was that kind of hazy blue you only see at high altitude. I felt good. My legs were strong, pack felt manageable, and the trail started gently. The path wound up through pine forests and across small streams. The first day passed without any issue. I covered about 10 miles, stopping at a meadow that sloped out toward a rocky ridge. I set up camp before sunset, boiled some water, ate a freeze-dried meal, and sat watching the light fade behind the mountains. The quiet was the kind of quiet you don't get anywhere else. Just the wind, the trees creaking, the occasional far-off bird call. I slept well that first night. On the second day, things began to shift. The trail led upward quickly, with a steady climb that put me above the tree line by mid-morning. The weather changed fast at that elevation. What started as a warm morning turned into a biting wind that cut right through my jacket. I put on a fleece, pulled my hood tight, and kept moving. There was a long section of rocky ridgeline that stretched for maybe 4 miles, with steep drop-offs on both sides and nowhere really safe to stop for more than a minute. I pushed through it with focus, trying not to think too much about the height or how narrow the path had become in places. 1 foot in front of the other. After the ridgeline, the trail dropped into a valley where a wide creek flowed through a mix of low brush and stunted pines. It was there that I saw the first sign of something off. Near the bend in the creek, I came across an abandoned backpack sitting just off the trail. It was old, dirty, sun-bleached. Looked like it had been sitting there a long time. The zipper was half open, and inside I could see a shredded tarp and what looked like a rusted stove. I didn't touch it. I assumed it belonged to someone who had gotten careless or hurt. That area saw plenty of through hikers in summer, and not everyone made it out. I kept moving. That night, I camped a little lower, near a grove of fir trees by a small pond. I felt more tired than I should have, but I told myself it was the elevation and the steady climb. I didn't eat much, just a protein bar and some jerky. I felt uneasy for reasons I couldn't explain. Nothing loud, nothing obvious. Just a kind of pressure in the air, like the silence had gotten heavier somehow. I woke up around 3 a.m. to what I thought were footsteps outside my tent. I froze, heart pounding. I lay there in my sleeping bag, barely breathing. But nothing happened. No voices, no more steps, just that wind again. I convinced myself it was a deer or some other animal and eventually fell back asleep, but it wasn't a restful sleep. The third day is where everything started to fall apart. It started with the trail becoming harder to follow. Sections of it were washed out, probably from spring runoff, and I had to climb around broken switchbacks and cross muddy slopes that felt too steep to be safe. My GPS, which had been reliable up until then, started acting weird, glitchy, freezing, jumping my position around by half a mile. I tried switching it off and back on. Same issue. I pulled out my paper map and compass and checked my location manually. It looked like I was still on course, but I wasn't fully sure. The area had too many intersecting ridges and the valleys started to look the same. I kept moving, trusting the trail would become clearer. By late afternoon, I realized I had taken a wrong turn somewhere. The trail had narrowed into something that barely resembled a footpath. It sloped steeply downward into a forested ravine, with thick underbrush and wet rocks. I backtracked to where I thought I had gone off course, but every turn looked familiar, and nothing on the map matched what I was seeing. I tried climbing back to a ridge to get a better view, but the slope was too loose. I slipped twice, the second time scraping my forearm bad enough to bleed through my sleeve. I sat down to clean it, feeling the first real wave of panic. It was late in the day and I didn't know where I was. I told myself to stay calm. I still had food, still had water, and plenty of daylight left. I picked the most likely direction and kept walking. The forest thickened. There was no sign of the trail, just dense pine, uneven ground, and tangled roots. The light faded fast once the sun dropped behind the trees. I gave up trying to find my way back and decided to set up camp right there on the flattest patch I could find. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I kept hearing noises, twigs snapping, leaves shifting, things moving through the brush too heavy to be just wind. I couldn't see anything outside the tent, just blackness. I had my bear spray clutched in one hand, my pocket knife in the other, even though I knew neither would do much if something really went wrong. I stayed awake the whole night, staring at the roof of the tent and listening to the forest breathe. By the fourth morning, I had used up half my food and most of my calm. I broke camp and tried again to orient myself. I climbed toward what I thought might be a ridgeline, but it turned out to be just a cluster of high boulders. No views, no landmarks. My GPS was dead. My phone showed no signal, not even a flicker. I started marking trees with small cuts from my knife to avoid walking in circles. I stopped often to listen. No voices, no trail signs, just birds and the constant rustling of trees in the wind. Around midday, I stumbled on something that didn't make sense. A blue tarp, ripped and dirty, stretched across a fallen log to make a kind of shelter. Underneath were old food wrappers, an empty fuel canister, and a torn sleeping bag. Everything was sun-faded and moldy. Someone had camped there a long time ago and left in a hurry. Maybe never left at all. There was a sharp smell of rot in the air, and I backed away quickly. I didn't want to know more. I kept walking, more desperate now. My water bottle was almost empty. I hadn't seen a stream since the second day. I drank the last of it that afternoon. By evening, I was dry-mouthed and dizzy. I kept thinking I could hear someone behind me, but every time I stopped, the sound stopped too. It was probably just my nerves. Probably. I camped again, but didn't pitch the tent. I just laid my sleeping bag out under a tree and curled up with my pack. My feet hurt, my shoulders ached, and the scrape on my arm was swollen and warm. I was starting to realize how serious things had gotten. That night, I heard something come close. I could hear it breathing, heavy, animal-like, not human. It circled me in the dark, slow, sniffing. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I lay there clutching my bear spray, eyes shut tight. Whatever it was eventually moved on, crashing through the underbrush until it was gone. I didn't sleep after that. The next day, I didn't care about the trail. I didn't care about maps. I just started walking in one direction, east. I figured if I kept that heading, eventually I'd hit a road, a town, something. I was wrong. The ground became steep again, and I had to scramble across rocks slick with moss. I fell twice, twisting my knee and slamming my hip into a boulder. I bit my tongue so hard it bled. I kept going anyway. Hours passed, maybe 5 or 6. The light started to change again. And then, finally, I heard a sound I hadn't heard in days, running water. I followed it, sliding and crawling down a slope until I reached a narrow stream. I drank until I gagged, filled my bottle and sat there crying. Not out of joy, just relief that I wasn't done yet. I followed that stream the rest of the day. It led into a wider valley, one that felt familiar. Then, around sunset, I saw it, a trail marker. Faded paint on a wooden post, half buried under dirt and weeds. I'd found the main trail again. I collapsed and slept right there on the path. The next morning, I walked. Just walked. Didn't stop. I limped through the pain in my knee and the stinging in my arm. I passed a couple more trail signs, ones I recognized from my map. And then, just before I don't really talk about this hike anymore. Not because I forgot about it, I couldn't forget if I tried, but because every time I tell the story, people think I'm exaggerating. They think I'm trying to make it sound more dramatic than it was. But I don't need to. I lived it, and the truth is bad enough on its own. This happened in the summer of 2017. I was 34 at the time, living in Spokane, Washington. I worked at a small home renovation company. I didn't make much, but I had a reliable little truck, a secondhand backpack, and a pair of worn-in boots. On weekends, I used to hike to clear my head. Not the crowded trails with signs and families and picnic benches. I liked the rougher stuff. Trails that people forgot about. The kind that disappeared under leaves and logs and came back again 2 miles later. That summer, I started driving farther out to find quieter places. I'd stop by ranger stations or dig through old hiking forums and trail books to find barely used paths. One name kept coming up in a few different places: Galloway Ridge. There wasn't much on it. No photos, no reviews. Just mentions of it being part of an old logging area from decades ago, with barely any trail maintenance and almost no foot traffic. That was exactly what I wanted. The trailhead was in a forested section northeast of Colville, maybe 2 hours from my place. You had to take a few rough service roads to even reach it, and the last one had more potholes than gravel. I remember passing a small, rotting sign with the letters Galway barely visible through moss. That was it. I parked my truck off to the side, threw my pack on, and started in. The plan was to do a big loop, up the ridge, down the northern side, then circle back on a parallel trail. I had enough food and water for 2 days, plus my emergency gear. I wasn't expecting anything extreme. I had checked the forecast: 78 degrees, partly cloudy, no rain for at least 3 days. Everything looked perfect. The first few miles were uneventful. The trail was overgrown like I expected, but it was there. Dirt, old pine needles, occasional rusted trail markers. There were big trees everywhere, and the deeper I went, the more the noise of the road disappeared behind me. I saw a few old stumps with the wedge marks from saws, probably left from the logging operations in the 1960s. You could tell no one had hiked this area in a long time. There were downed trees across the path that hadn't been cleared in years, animal tracks crisscrossing sections of the trail, and whole parts of it that were barely a trail anymore. I made good time going up the ridge. It was steep in places, but nothing crazy. Mostly just long stretches of slow uphill walking. Around early afternoon, I reached the crest. You couldn't really see much because the trees were so thick, but the light changed up there. It got dimmer, cooler, more shaded. I decided to keep going a bit before setting up camp. The map I had showed a small clearing maybe a mile ahead, a flat spot beside a stream. I figured that would be a good place to stop for the night. I didn't realize it until later, but something started to feel off once I crossed the ridge. Not anything obvious, just little things. The way the underbrush felt heavier. The way the birds seemed quieter. The air smelled different too, more like wet wood, even though it hadn't rained. I told myself I was overthinking it. I'd hiked in weird places before, and sometimes the land just had its own personality. I reached the clearing around 4:30 p.m. It wasn't exactly like the map showed. It was smaller, and the stream was barely more than a trickle, but it was flat enough to pitch my tent. I cleared a space, set up, boiled some water, and ate one of those instant noodle bags I always carried. I didn't build a fire, I usually don't, just sat there listening. The forest was dead quiet. That night, I didn't sleep well. It wasn't the cold. It wasn't the bugs. I've dealt with worse. I just couldn't stay asleep. I kept waking up every hour or so, always with the feeling that something was moving nearby. Not animals rustling around, not trees creaking, something quieter, like footsteps or branches being pushed aside gently. But whenever I sat up and listened, it was silent. I must have gotten a few hours of sleep, broken up into pieces. When I woke up for good, it was just before sunrise. Pale light was coming through the trees, and the air felt heavy. I packed up quickly. I wanted to keep moving. The trail on the north side of the ridge was harder to follow. It dropped down steeply with fewer signs of anyone ever maintaining it. I kept checking my map, trying to match landmarks, the curve of the ridge, a rock outcrop, an old logging road, but nothing lined up exactly. After about an hour, I realized the trail had disappeared entirely. I doubled back to where I last saw a marker, a rusted piece of tin nailed to a tree, and tried again, moving slower this time. Still no trail. Everything looked the same. Trees, ferns, moss, the occasional half-rotten stump. My compass said I was going in the right direction, but the ground kept sloping in ways that didn't match the map. Eventually, I gave up trying to follow the trail and started bushwhacking directly northeast, hoping I'd intersect the return trail further down. That's when things started to unravel. The ground got swampy, not full-on marsh, but soft and slick. I slipped a few times, one foot plunging down into cold mud. The mosquitoes were thicker there, buzzing around my neck and ears nonstop. I stopped once to drink some water and saw that my arm was bleeding from a long scratch I didn't remember getting. Just a thin line, probably from a branch, but it was the first mark I had on me. Somehow that made it feel more real, like this wasn't just a challenging hike, but something I could get hurt in. By mid-morning, I still hadn't found the other trail. My GPS, an old handheld unit I kept more for backup than anything, couldn't get a solid signal. The trees were too thick. I kept moving, and then I found the cabin. It wasn't on my map. It wasn't in any of the notes or forum posts I'd read. It looked old, really old. The roof had partially caved in on one side, and the whole thing leaned like it had sunk into the ground. There were rusted tools hanging off the side, and the door was hanging open. I stood there for a long time just looking at it. I didn't want to go in. I really didn't, but I needed a place to sit, dry my boots, maybe look at my compass and map without standing in mud. So I stepped inside. It smelled like mold and old wood. The floor was soft in places, with moss growing between the boards. There was a cot in the corner, a rusted-out stove, and an old lantern on a table. Someone had lived there once. Maybe a logger, maybe a hunter. There were old cans in a corner, labels faded off. A pair of boots sat near the door, half collapsed from rot. I sat on the edge of the cot and pulled off my boots, wringing out my socks. That's when I noticed the marks on the floor. At first I thought they were just lines from the board's warping, but they were too regular. Straight, narrow tracks, like something had been dragged, or like something had walked back and forth the same way again and again. The more I looked, the more lines I saw, all leading from the door to the cot and back. Some deeper than others, some old, some newer. That's when I left. I didn't put my boots back on, just grabbed them and left barefoot, walking fast at first, then running once I hit firmer ground. The worst part was, and I still hate thinking about it, I'm not sure why I ran. There was nothing in the cabin. No sounds, no sign of anyone. But the way the tracks looked, the way they overlapped like someone pacing for days always between the door and the bed, it made my skin crawl. Like someone had been waiting. I didn't try to find the trail anymore. I just wanted out. I followed the slope downhill, figuring I'd hit a road eventually. But the deeper I went, the worse it got. The forest changed. Trees were thinner, but the ground was messier. Deadfall everywhere, thorn bushes, unstable slopes. I slipped again and hit my knee hard on a rock. When I stood up, it felt loose. I could still walk, but every step burned. Hours passed. I rationed the last of my water, chewed through a granola bar without really tasting it. I kept checking my compass, but I didn't trust it anymore. I didn't trust anything. The sun was getting low again. I didn't want to spend another night out there, not after the first one. That's when I heard the chains. It wasn't a loud sound, just a faint clink, like metal links brushing against each other. I stopped, listened, came again. Clink, clink, then silence. I turned and moved in the opposite direction. Fast. I don't know what made that sound. Maybe a loose metal sign in the wind. Maybe an animal stepping on something. But it followed me. Not constantly, just every few minutes. Clink, clink, always faint, always behind me. When I finally saw the logging road, I almost cried. It was more like a rut, barely wide enough for a truck, but it was straight and clear. I limped down it for over an hour until I saw the first tire tracks. Fresh ones. Eventually, I came to a closed gate. Beyond it, another road.